Three elite military canines. One locked in a corner, shaking. One standing over his handler like a wall of teeth in fury. One lying flat on the floor, eyes open, refusing to move, refusing to eat, refusing to exist. The best military veterinarians in the country had been working the problem for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of behavioral protocols, pharmaceutical trials, specialist consultations. Nothing. Zero. Then a trauma nurse in paper-thin scrubs walked through the wrong door by accident, and by noon, all three dogs had done something no one in that room had seen in months. They moved. This is how it happened. Before we go further, if stories like this one hit different for you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning started the way most bad mornings do. Quietly, without warning, looking like nothing at all. Crest Veterans Medical Center sat at the edge of Dunbar Falls, the kind of mid-sized city that had exactly one military base nearby and exactly one hospital that served it. The facility was not glamorous. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. The floors were that specific shade of beige that no designer would ever choose on purpose. The elevators were slow. The cafeteria coffee was terrible, but the staff was solid, and the trauma unit had a reputation that stretched well past the city limits, which was the only thing that mattered to the people who ended up there. Emily Vasquez had been working the 7th floor for 3 years. She was 31, which made her one of the younger nurses on the trauma rotation, and she had the kind of face that made patients think she was still a student, open, watchful, not particularly striking until she was right in front of you, and you noticed her eyes, which were steady in a way that most people's weren't. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight during shifts. She wore the standard issue white scrubs because she hadn't bothered to order the colored ones. She carried a battered clipboard instead of a tablet because she'd dropped 2 tablets in the past 18 months and had stopped pretending that wasn't going to keep happening. On that particular Tuesday morning, she was running late. Not late, 7 minutes, which, at Maple Crest, was just late enough to mean that the elevator to the administrative corridor would be packed, and she'd have to take the stairs. And the stairs on the north side of the building were perpetually cold no matter what season it was, and she had not brought a jacket because she was 7 minutes late and therefore had made approximately 4 bad decisions before 6:40 a.m. The files she was carrying were not complicated. Transfer documentation for 3 patients in the Canine Rehabilitation Wing, a joint program Maple Crest had been running with the base for the past 2 years, handling both the human handlers and, in a separate but connected ward on the 4th floor, their working dogs. The program was newer than people realized and more underfunded than it looked, and most of the regular nursing staff avoided the canine wing because it made them nervous in ways they couldn't articulate. Emily had been to the 4th floor twice before, both times for file delivery. Both times she'd looked through the reinforced window at the dogs in the rehabilitation kennels and felt something she hadn't fully put words to. Not pity, exactly. Something more complicated. She took the stairs, pushed through the north stairwell door and immediately regretted it because, yes, still cold, somehow always cold, and started down toward 4. She heard the noise before she reached the landing. Not barking. Something lower than barking. A sound that moved through the floor, almost a sustained guttural vibration that had no clean category. She slowed on the stairs without deciding to slow down. Her hand tightened slightly on the file folder. The sound stopped, then started again, different this time, sharper. She pushed through the 4th floor door. The hallway was full of people. That was the first wrong thing. The canine rehab wing was never full of people at 6:45 in the morning. It ran on a skeleton crew before 7, 2 handlers, and 1 vet tech, and the whole corridor usually had the hushed, controlled quiet of a space where noise was being carefully managed. There were at least 12 people in the hallway right now. Military, mostly. She could tell by the posture before she registered the uniforms. 2 of them were in full dress, which meant something official was happening or had already gone wrong. 3 were in scrubs. 2 she recognized from the veterinary staff. 1 she didn't. There was a civilian in a button-down shirt with the collar open, holding a tablet and looking at it the way people look at things they don't want to show are bad. And there were 2 MPs near the far door, not blocking it exactly, but close enough. Nobody looked at her when she came through the door. She walked to the nurse's station at the wing entrance where Donna Frick, the K-9 Wing's charge nurse, who was 54 and had the energy of someone who had stopped tolerating nonsense approximately a decade ago, was on the phone with her back turned. Emily set the file folder on the desk and stood there. Donna finished the call, turned, saw Emily, and for a half-second her expression was the expression of someone who had forgotten to lock a door and was now watching weather come through it. "You're delivering the Harmon files," Donna said. It was not a question. "Yeah, 7th floor asked me to bring them down directly because—" "Leave them. Sign the receipt." Donna slid a form across the desk without looking at it. "Then go." Emily picked up the pen. "What's happening?" "Nothing you need to worry about." Down the hall, the sound started again. That low, sustained vibration. Emily's hand stopped moving across the form. "Donna." "Sign the form, Emily." "Is that a dog?" "3 dogs," Donna said, and something in her voice changed just slightly, not softer, but more tired. "3 dogs and approximately 40 years of combined military expertise that can't figure out what to do with them. So please, sign the form." Emily signed the form. She set the pen down. She picked up her empty clipboard. She did not leave. Donna noticed. "Emily, I just want to look. This is a restricted— I'm not going in. She was already moving toward the window. The reinforced one, the long rectangle of safety glass set into the wall beside the main door. "I just want to see." Donna let out a breath that communicated 17 different things, none of them approval, and turned back to her desk. The window looked into the primary rehabilitation room. It was large, the size of a generous living room, with padded flooring, low lighting, and a series of equipment stations along the far wall that were currently pushed aside. The room smelled, even through the glass, of the specific combination of antiseptic and animal that Emily associated with the wing. There were 3 dogs. She processed them one at a time because processing all 3 at once was too much. In the far left corner, a German Shepherd, large, male, sand and black coloring that spoke of desert deployment. He was not aggressive. He was pressed into the corner with his body angled slightly inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, and his eyes were tracking every person in the room with an alertness that looked exhausting. A soldier was seated about 4 feet away from him, young, early 20s, in a hospital gown over civilian clothes, shoulders rounded and chin down. The dog kept looking at the soldier. The soldier kept looking at the floor. In the center of the room, a Belgian Malinois, younger and leaner, standing directly in front of a cot on which a man in navy scrubs was lying with his eyes closed and one arm over his face. The Malinois was not moving. He was planted between the cot and the rest of the room like something structural, like part of the architecture. And every time one of the veterinary staff took a step in his direction, a sound came out of him that was not quite a growl. It was below a growl, something that lived in the floor. That was the sound she'd heard from the stairwell. And near the room's entrance, lying flat on the padded floor with his chin on his paws and his eyes half open, a Labrador mix, older, dark brown with patches of gray around his muzzle. I was not reacting to anything, not to voices, not to the movement around him, not to the treat that one of the vet techs was holding approximately 18 inches from his nose and had apparently been holding for a while based on the vet tech's expression. The lab wasn't asleep. He was somewhere else. Emily stood at the window and looked at the 3 of them and felt the complicated thing again, more clearly this time. Behind her, the door to the hallway opened, and a man came through it with the energy of someone who had been solving problems since before sunrise and had not yet found a single one he liked. I was tall, mid-50s, silver at his temples, wearing a white coat over military-issued clothing. The combination that meant he was a uniformed veterinarian, which at Maple Crest meant he outranked most of the people in the building on anything related to the K-9 program. His name tag said DR, Warren Cole, and below that his rank, which Emily's eyes passed over without fully registering. He stopped when he saw her at the window. "Who are you?" he said. "7th floor trauma. I was dropping off files." "Then you're done." He said it without heat, the way people say things when the dismissal is so automatic it requires no energy. He moved past her toward the door. "The shepherd in the corner isn't afraid of the room," Emily said. Cole stopped. She hadn't entirely planned to say it, but she'd said it, and now it was in the air, and she looked at the dog again rather than at Cole. "He's watching the soldier," she said, "not the staff. He's not afraid of the hospital. He's afraid the person next to him is falling apart, and he doesn't know how to stop it." A pause. Behind her, she was aware of Donna looking up from the desk. Cole turned slowly. "You have a veterinary background?" "No." "Behavioral science?" "No." "Then with respect," he said, and the phrase landed the way it always lands when it precedes the opposite of respect. "You're looking at a German Shepherd who has not responded to 6 weeks of specialized intervention by some of the most experienced canine behavioral specialists in the military system. So whatever you think you're seeing through a window—" "I'm not saying I can fix him," Emily said. "I'm saying the problem isn't the dog." Cole looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when someone is deciding between several responses and hasn't landed on one yet. "Ma'am," one of the MPs said from the far door, not quite stepping forward, but the intention was there. "I'll go," Emily said. She went. She made it back to the 7th floor, handed off the receipt copy to the floor coordinator, took her first patient of the morning, a post-surgical case, straightforward, vitals stable, and spent approximately 45 minutes successfully not thinking about the 4th floor. Then her charge nurse, Pete Alvarez, found her in the supply room. "4th floor called up," Pete said. He was leaning in the doorway, which was his preferred posture for conversations he hadn't fully decided to have yet. "Dr. Cole's office." Emily looked up from the supply shelf. "Why?" "They want you to come back down." She put the IV supplies on the cart. "Why?" she said again. Pete shrugged, but his eyes were doing something more specific than his shoulders. "You said something to the vet doc this morning." "I said one thing." "Yeah, well, apparently one thing was enough." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll cover your patient for an hour. Whatever you did, try not to undo it." She went back down to 4. The hallway was less crowded now. The 2 dress uniform officers were gone, and the MP presence had reduced to 1. Donna was still at the desk, and she gave Emily a look that communicated cautious neutrality, which from Donna was approximately equivalent to enthusiasm. Cole was waiting outside the main room door. He had taken off his white coat, which made him look slightly more like a person and slightly less like a position. He had his arms crossed, which undermined the effect. "I want to be clear," he said, before she'd fully reached him. "I don't know what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to do anything, technically. We're going to go in the room, and you're going to observe, and if you see something useful, you can say it." "Okay," Emily said. "The Malinois is the primary safety concern. Don't approach the cot." "Okay." He looked at her like he was waiting for her to add something, a credential, a caveat, a reason he could point to later if this went badly. She didn't add anything. He opened the door. The smell hit her first, that antiseptic animal combination, plus something underneath it that she could only describe as weight. The room felt pressurized, like the air had been sitting too long and hadn't been moved in days. The shepherd, the one she'd pegged as the one watching his soldier, turned his head immediately when she came in. Not aggressive. Tracking. His eyes found her, held for a moment, then flicked to the soldier, who was still in the same position, still looking at the floor. The vet tech who had been working with the shepherd stood up quickly, relieved in the way people are relieved when someone else enters a room where they've been stuck. "Sergeant Marcus Webb," Cole said quietly, beside her. 24 years old. Army Ranger, 3rd deployment. Ranger, the dog, has been his partner for 4 years. Webb's been in treatment here for 6 weeks. Ranger arrived with him and has refused standard kenneling. We made the accommodation, but it hasn't produced progress, in either of them. Emily looked at Webb. He hadn't looked up when she came in. His hands were resting on his knees, slightly open, the way hands rest when a person has stopped thinking about where to put them. She crossed the room, not toward the dog, toward the soldier. She sat down in the chair that the vet tech had vacated, which put her about 3 feet from Webb, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Ranger was watching her from the corner, still not moving. "Hey," Emily said. To Webb, not the dog. Webb looked up. His eyes were gray and exhausted in a specific way, not from lack of sleep, but from the particular fatigue of someone who had been maintaining a surface for a long time. He looked at her hospital badge. "You're not from this unit." "No, 7th floor, trauma." He looked back at the floor. They sending different people now. I'm not here to run a protocol on you, she said. I was in the hallway this morning and I asked to come back. So if you want me to go, just say it. He didn't say it. Ranger shifted in the corner, just slightly. His weight moved from his left side to his right and his head lowered an inch. Not relaxing. Something more careful than relaxing. He doesn't like the room, Webb said after a moment. I don't think that's what it is, Emily said. Webb looked at her again. I think he's been watching you since you got here, she said, and he can't figure out how to help. And that's the part that's breaking him. Something moved through Webb's face, not emotion exactly, but the tectonic shift that happens just before emotion, when a person realizes they've been looked at clearly. He's a dog, Webb said, but his voice didn't carry the dismissal his words were reaching for. He's your partner, Emily said. That's different. A long silence. From across the room she could feel Cole watching, and the vet tech, and the single MP near the door, and all of them holding very still. He keeps trying to do things, Webb said, low, almost to himself. Trying to put himself between me and the door, between me and the staff, like he's still working. A pause. Like he's waiting for me to give him a command that's going to make it okay. Emily said, and you don't have one. Webb's jaw tightened. He looked away. Ranger moved. Not across the room, just forward, about 2 feet, coming out of the corner, his body still low and careful. He stopped and sat, closer now, and turned his head slightly to look at Emily. Behind her, she heard Cole draw a quiet breath. He spent years taking care of you, Emily said to Webb. She wasn't performing it. Her voice was level, matter-of-fact, the same voice she used at 2 in the morning in the trauma bay when she needed a patient to hear something that mattered. Let someone take care of him for a while. And you. Webb didn't answer, but his hands, which had been resting open on his knees, slowly closed, just the right one, into a loose fist. It was the smallest possible movement, and it communicated more than a paragraph would have. Ranger stood up, walked across the room, lay down at Webb's feet. The vet tech made a sound that was not quite professional. Emily stood up quietly and moved away, not out of the room, just back, giving the space back to the two of them. She became part of the wall. Cole came to stand beside her. He was very quiet for a moment. That's the first time he's moved voluntarily in 11 days, he said. Emily said nothing. How did you... I didn't do anything with the dog, she said. I talked to the person. Cole turned to look at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not admiration exactly, more like recalibration. The expression of someone who has held a working model of a problem for a long time and has just discovered the model was slightly wrong. Before he could say anything else, the door opened. One of the vet techs, not the one in the room, a different one, leaned in with the expression of someone who has news they didn't volunteer to carry. Dr. Cole, Ghost is in crisis. The Malinois. Cole moved toward the door. He paused and looked back at Emily. He didn't say anything, but the look said something, and she followed him. The secondary holding area was around the corner, a smaller room, and through its window the scene was immediately legible as a problem. The Malinois, Ghost, was on his feet, and the man on the cot, the Navy sailor whose name she didn't know yet, was sitting up now, which had somehow made things worse. Ghost was moving in tight circles around the cot, not aggressive, not attacking, just cycling, and the sound coming out of him was not a growl and not a bark, and not anything that had a clean name. He started when Petty Officer Salazar sat up, the vet tech said. We don't know why that set him off. He was calm before. Emily looked through the window. Ghost wasn't cycling because Salazar had sat up. Ghost was cycling because Salazar sitting up had changed something in the room, had changed the configuration that Ghost had been holding in his body, the specific positioning between himself and his handler that he had apparently worked out as the right answer to a question no one in the room understood. Can I go in? Emily said. Absolutely not, Cole said. I won't approach the dog. You're a trauma nurse. Right now that's the most useful thing in the room, she said, because Salazar looks like he needs medical attention and nobody's been close enough to check. Cole looked through the window, then at her. You stay near the door. You don't move toward the cot unless I say. She went in. Ghost's head snapped toward her the moment the door opened. The cycling stopped. He was still, suddenly, completely, and his eyes were on her with an intensity that she felt physically, a kind of attention that had weight. She did not look at him directly. She looked at a point slightly past him, toward the wall, and she moved at a pace that was careful but not slow, because slow was its own kind of signal, and she knew it. She stopped 6 feet from the cot, far left of the room, out of Ghost's established perimeter. Salazar looked at her. He was late 30s, dark circles deep enough to look structural, the kind of pallor that came from sustained physical suppression of something. His arm, the one that had been over his face, was resting across his abdomen, and she could see, even from 6 feet, that he was breathing shallowly. "How long has your chest been tight?" she said. Salazar blinked. "How'd you—" "Your breathing's changed since you sat up, short and high." "How long?" A pause. Ghost took 1 step toward her, stopped. "Couple days," Salazar said. "Pain anywhere?" Not really pain. Pressure." Emily turned her head slightly toward the door. Cole was watching through the window. "I need a stethoscope and a BP cuff in here," she said, just loud enough. "And someone call cardiology for a consult." She turned back to Salazar. Ghost was looking at her, still not attacking, still not retreating, just watching with that massive, burning attention. "Your dog has been managing your symptoms for you," Emily said to Salazar, not moving toward the cot. "That's what he does with you, right? When you're struggling, he positions himself. He's been doing that since you got here." Salazar's face shifted. He looked at Ghost. He's been carrying something you weren't putting down," Emily said. "And it's not sustainable, for either of you." The door opened behind her. A vet tech came in carefully, stethoscope and cuff, and handed them to Emily without speaking. Ghost watched the tech leave, then turned back to Emily. She walked to the cot. Slowly, not hesitating, straight line. Ghost didn't move. She put the stethoscope on and listened. His lungs were not good. Not emergency grade, not yet, but the kind of not good that had been ignored for long enough to be building into something. She wrapped the cuff and pumped it up and read the number and kept her face neutral because the number was information, and Salazar didn't need to see her react to it before she'd decided what to say. "You have been ignoring a real physical problem," she told him, "because you didn't want to need more than you already needed." Salazar exhaled. It was the exhale of someone who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. "He knew," Salazar said. He was looking at Ghost. "He knew before I did." "Yeah," Emily said. "He usually does." Ghost walked to the cot, placed his chin on the edge of the mattress. Salazar put his hand on the back of the dog's neck, and the sound Ghost had been making, that sustained underground vibration, finally stopped. The room was so quiet after it that Emily could hear the ventilation system cycling. She turned. Cole was in the doorway, watching. Past him, she could see the cluster of staff in the hallway, all of them still, all of them looking at this room. Cole said, "The third dog." "Atlas." She had almost forgotten about Atlas. Almost. She walked into the hallway, and the staff parted around her in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with something else, something she was not going to think too hard about. She walked to the far end of the corridor, to the third room, the one she hadn't been in yet, and she stopped at the window. The brown Labrador was still flat on the floor, chin on his paws, eyes half open. There was no handler in the room with him, no soldier, no sailor, no one. Just the dog and a vet tech sitting on the floor 6 feet away, looking exhausted, the treat still in her hand. Still not working, still nothing. Cole came to stand beside Emily at the window. "Atlas," he said, "retired Marine combat dog. His handler was a gunnery sergeant named Dwight Pruitt. Pruitt was killed in action 14 months ago. Atlas was repatriated through the standard program. He's been through 2 placement attempts. Both failed. He was brought here 4 weeks ago as a last measure before—" He stopped. "Before what?" Emily said. Cole didn't answer directly. "He's not eating consistently. He's not responding to commands, toys, rewards, or personnel, including handlers who knew him in the field. He's completely disengaged." Emily looked at the dog. He wasn't sick. She could see that. His body was maintaining itself, breathing, blinking, the physical minimum. But the rest of him, the part that made a dog a presence in a room, was somewhere unreachable. She'd seen that once before. Not in a dog. "I'm going in," she said. "Emily." Cole's voice was different now. Not dismissing her, but something closer to concern. He's not a behavioral case in the standard sense. We don't know what he might... I'm not going to approach him, she said. I'm going to sit near the entrance and talk. Talk. Yeah. To the dog. No, she said. Not exactly. Cole stared at her. She pushed open the door. The vet tech looked up, startled. Atlas didn't move. Emily crossed to the near wall, sat down on the floor, not against the wall exactly, just near it, knees up, back casual, the posture of someone who had nowhere to be. She did not look at Atlas. She looked at the floor in front of her, at her own hands. The vet tech started to say something. Emily shook her head once, minimal, and the tech closed her mouth. The room was quiet. Atlas didn't look at her. Emily said quietly, "He promised to take you home." Her voice was flat, not dramatic, just a statement, dropped into the air like something small and heavy. The vet tech went completely still. Atlas's eyes moved, not his head, just his eyes, tracking toward her and then away. He had plans, Emily said, specific plans, not just someday. He had a place in mind, you knew it. Dogs know. She paused. And then he didn't come back. The gray around Atlas's muzzle caught the light. And everybody since then has been trying to give you commands, she said, like you were broken, like the problem was something that could be fixed with the right technique. Atlas's head shifted. Not much. Half an inch. His chin stayed on his paws, but his body was no longer completely inert. Emily looked at her hands. I know what it's like, she said, to wait for someone who isn't coming. To keep the same space open for them because closing it means something you're not ready for. The room held its breath. Atlas lifted his head. Just his head. Off his paws, 3 inches. His eyes were fully open now, and they were on her. And they were the specific eyes of a creature who had seen too much and trusted too rarely, and was, right now, running some calculation that had nothing to do with commands or treats or trained behavior. From somewhere behind her, through the small window in the door, she was aware of Cole watching. She didn't move toward Atlas. She stayed exactly where she was, hands in her lap, on the floor, looking at nothing in particular. And Atlas held his head up. Held it. Then he put it back down on his paws. But the position was different. His body had shifted, almost imperceptibly, so that he was no longer angled away from her. He was angled toward her. His eyes stayed open. The vet tech made a sound that was so quiet it might have been a breath. Emily stayed on the floor. She stayed for 20 minutes without moving, without speaking again, without doing anything at all. And in those 20 minutes, Atlas remained awake, remained oriented toward her, and twice, exhaled long and slow in a way that was different from every exhale that had come before it. When she finally stood, her knees ached, and Cole was waiting in the hall with an expression she had never seen on a person of his particular professional authority. He looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been handed a question he did not know how to answer. He opened his mouth. And then the sound started. Not from the dog rooms. From the hallway itself. Boots on linoleum, fast, more than 2 pairs, and a radio crackling with something that was being said quickly and not fully decoded before the door at the end of the corridor banged open and 2 MPs came through, followed by a man in army dress uniform. Full dress, colonel's insignia, a face that was doing the careful work of containing something urgent. He spotted Cole immediately. Dr. Cole, we have a situation with the reintegration units. 3 handlers, secondary crisis, all K9 bonded. They're being transferred here in the next 40 minutes. He looked at the file in his hand, then up. Command is requesting an immediate assessment protocol for all 6 animals and personnel. Cole said, we're in the middle of... I understand that. This isn't optional. Cole's jaw set. He looked at Emily. 6 animals, 6 handlers. The 3 he currently had, which had taken 6 weeks to reach this moment, and now 3 more arriving in 40 minutes, and whatever had just broken open down the corridor toward them was carrying its own damage, and its own weight, and its own language that everyone in this building was only just beginning to learn to read. Emily looked at this colonel's file. She could see, upside down at the bottom of the first page, a notation in red that she couldn't fully read except for 2 words. The 2 words were last option. The 2 words stayed in Emily's head as the colonel moved past her like she was furniture. Last option. She didn't know what command had written it, or what the notation above it said, or what specific sequence of failures had produced those two words in red at the bottom of a transfer file. But she knew what they meant in a hospital context, and she suspected they meant something close to the same thing in a military canine context, and neither version was good. Cole was already moving with the colonel toward the far end of the hall, their voices dropping into the register of men who have information they're not distributing yet. The two MPs held position near the door. The vet tech who had been in with Atlas was still in the room, Emily realized. She'd left the woman there, which she hadn't entirely meant to do. She went back in. The vet tech, her name tag said Kyruger, T, was still on the floor. Atlas was in the same position he'd been in when Emily left, head down, but his eyes were open, and they were still oriented toward the space where Emily had been sitting rather than toward Kruger. "You can get up," Emily said. "Just move slowly." Kruger stood, joints popping. She was maybe 26, with the specific look of someone who had chosen this work because they loved animals and was currently having a complicated relationship with that choice. "He didn't move the whole time you were gone," she said, low. "But he didn't. He didn't go back either. He's still in the same spot." "I know." "What did you say to him?" Emily looked at Atlas. "Nothing much." Kruger studied her with the expression of someone who had just watched a magic trick and was trying to figure out whether to be impressed or annoyed that she couldn't see the mechanism. "Dr. Cole's been working this case for 4 weeks, she said. "We had a specialist fly in from Fort Belding 2 weeks ago. She spent 3 days. "I'm not a specialist," Emily said. "No," Kruger said. "I know." There was something in the word that wasn't quite an accusation and wasn't quite a compliment. Emily didn't answer it. She looked at Atlas one more time, the gray muzzle, the open eyes, the body that was no longer completely closed. And then she walked out. The hallway had reorganized itself while she was in the room. The colonel was at the nurse's station with Cole, and a third person had joined them. A woman in civilian clothes with a lanyard that had too many badges on it to read quickly, which usually meant administration. The MPs were still by the far door. Donna was at her desk, doing something on her computer with the precise concentration of someone who is deliberately not making eye contact. Emily started toward the elevator. "Vasquez," Cole's voice. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her from the nurse's station, and the colonel was looking at her too, and the woman with the badges had looked up from whatever she'd been reading. 3 different varieties of evaluation happening simultaneously. "Come here," Cole said. She went. Up close, the colonel was older than he'd looked from a distance. Mid-50s, the kind of weathered that came from extended outdoor service rather than years. His name tag said Hartfield. He was looking at her like he was solving an equation. "Dr. Cole tells me you're a trauma nurse," Hartfield said. "Yes, sir." "Not canine, not behavioral, not veterinary." "No." "And you've been down here for—" He glanced at Cole. "Approximately 2 hours," Cole said, "including the time she spent in contact with all 3 animals." Hartfield looked back at Emily. "What'd you do?" "I talked to the handlers," she said. "Mostly." A pause. "Mostly." "The dogs were responding to the handlers, so that's where I started." Hartfield was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who had spent years listening to briefings and had developed a finely calibrated sense of what was being left out of them. "Dr. Cole says the shepherd broke a 11-day behavioral plateau in under 20 minutes. He moved to his handler," Emily said. "That's the handler's progress, not mine." "The Malinois." "His handler needed medical attention. I assessed him. Ghost responded to the change in Salazar's state." "And Atlas." She paused. Atlas held his head up. Hartfield waited, clearly expecting more. "That's significant," Cole said quietly to Hartfield. "Trust me." Hartfield looked at the woman with the badges. Something passed between them that Emily couldn't fully read. Not disagreement, more like the negotiation of 2 people who had been in the same argument for long enough to shorthand it. "The 3 units coming in," Hartfield said, turning back to Emily. "They've been through standard processing, 2 cycles of canine behavioral intervention, 1 at Harmon Base, 1 at the Regional Veterinary Center in Selden. Neither produce sustainable results. The handlers are in varying states of crisis. The dogs are—" He stopped, looked at Cole. "Complicated," Cole said. We have 40 minutes before they arrive, Hartfield said. I'd like you present for the intake. Emily looked at him. I'm a trauma nurse, she said. I'm scheduled on the 7th floor. I'll clear it with your department head. Colonel, Ms. Vasquez. His voice wasn't loud. It had that particular military quality of not needing volume to communicate that a decision had been made. I've been trying to solve a problem for 6 weeks. You've been in this wing for 2 hours. I'm adjusting my approach. A pause. Unless you have an objection. She looked at the file on the desk. She couldn't see the red notation from here, but she knew it was there. I don't have an objection, she said. Hartfield nodded. He picked up the file and turned toward Cole. Walk me through what we have. Emily stood where she was for a moment. Donna was still at her desk, still looking at her computer screen. But as Emily turned toward the waiting area at the wing's end, Donna said quietly, without looking up, There's coffee in the back room. It's not terrible. Coming from Donna, that was practically a welcome party. Emily found the back room, small, cluttered with supply orders and the sediment of institutional life, a coffee maker that looked like it had survived multiple administrations. She poured a cup and stood at the small window that looked out over the facility's rear parking structure. She was tired. Not physically, not yet, but there was a particular kind of tired that came from being a certain kind of present with people for a sustained period, the kind where you weren't performing or managing but actually tracking, actually in it, and she'd been doing that at a higher intensity than usual since she'd come through the 4th floor door 3 hours ago. She thought about Webb and the way his hand had closed into a fist. She thought about Salazar's breathing, which she'd ordered a full cardiac workup on before she left the room, and which she hadn't yet heard back about. She thought about Atlas and the half-inch his head had moved off his paws. She thought about the 2 words in red. She was on her second cup when Kruger appeared in the doorway. They're here, early. Emily put down the cup. The 3 new handlers and their K9s came through the facility entrance in a configuration that had its own internal logic. Not quite chaos, but close enough to it that the staff who'd been positioning themselves for a controlled intake had to adjust fast. The first handler, a woman, was moving under her own power but barely, her left arm in a sling and her right hand gripping a lead attached to a large German Shepherd mix that was managing the situation better than she was. The second handler, a man in his 30s, was in a wheelchair that he was operating with the specific intensity of someone who had decided that using the wheelchair was the one compromise he was making, and he wasn't making any others. His dog, a smaller Malinois, black and tan, was walking beside the chair with its body angled slightly toward the handler's right side, compensating for something, though Emily couldn't immediately read what. The third handler had to be helped through the door by 2 medics, and his dog, another Labrador, this one younger than Atlas, golden-colored, was walking so close to the medics that one of them nearly tripped. Cole was at the front, Hartfield was behind him. 2 additional veterinary staff had materialized from somewhere, and Emily was standing in the hallway, which meant she was in the way unless she moved, and she didn't move because she was watching the dogs. The German Shepherd mix saw her first. It didn't react visibly, but something in its body language shifted. Not toward her, not away, just a recalibration, an acknowledgement of a data point. Emily held herself still. The dog looked away. The female handler, a sergeant, based on the insignia still on her jacket, was directed toward room 1, which had been cleared of Ranger and Webb, who were now in a separate space. The wheelchair handler went toward room 2. The third, the one being supported, was taken to the medical bay first, which was the right call. Cole caught Emily's eye across the corridor. He tilted his head toward room 1. She went. The sergeant's name was Torres. Sergeant First Class Nadia Torres, 38, and she had been injured not in combat but in the vehicle accident that had also injured her dog, Bravo, the German Shepherd mix, 4 months ago. The physical recovery on both of them had been textbook. The rest of it had not. Torres sat on the edge of the cot and watched Emily come through the door with the expression of someone who had been through intake enough times to have stopped performing anything for it. "Who are you?" Torres said. Not rude, just direct. "Trauma nurse, 7th floor." Emily sat in the chair across from her. "I've been down here this morning." "Why?" "Wrong place, right time." "Maybe." Torres looked at Bravo, who was standing near the door, watching Cole and the vet tech with the flat attention of a dog who had been assessed many times and had formed opinions about it. "They send you in to warm me up?" "No. Emily said, because that's been tried. I know. The guy at Harmon, he started every session asking me how I felt. 3 weeks. Every morning. How do you feel, Sergeant Torres? Her voice shifted into something that was not quite mockery, but had mockery's shape. I started lying after day 2. It's easier. What'd you tell him? Him? Fine, better, making progress. She paused. He wrote it all down. Emily looked at Bravo. The dog had stopped watching the vet tech and was now watching Torres, the way Ranger had watched Webb. That specific alert tracking that was not anxiety and not aggression, but something in between, something generated by care that didn't have a channel. The accident, Emily said. He was in the vehicle? Torres's jaw tightened. Rear seat. The impact. He hit the side panel, cracked 2 ribs, punctured a lung. He was in veterinary intensive care for 9 days. She was quiet for a moment. I had a concussion. And the arm. She gestured at the sling. I was cleared to move around before he was. I used to sit outside the vet ICU and just... She stopped. Yeah, Emily said. Torres looked at her. You don't have a clipboard. No. The other ones always have clipboards. I know. Bravo took 2 steps away from the door, toward the cot. He stopped and looked at Torres, and Torres looked back at him, and what passed between them was not a command and not a trained behavior. It was recognition, plain and mutual, the kind that has nothing to do with training. He blames himself, Torres said. I know that sounds... It doesn't. He was trained to protect me, and he couldn't. Her voice was steady, impressively steady. And I've been acting like I'm okay so he doesn't have to worry, which is... I know how that sounds too. He knows anyway, Emily said. Torres exhaled. The lying to each other, Emily said. That's the part that's keeping both of you stuck. A long pause. Bravo took another step toward the cot. Torres's good hand moved slightly, an automatic reach toward him that she caught and stopped. The gesture of someone who had been suppressing that reflex for a while because allowing it felt like an admission. You can reach for him, Emily said. I don't want to. He needs you to. Torres looked at her dog. Her hand, the right one, dropped from her knee and extended, palm open. Not a command, just an offer. Bravo covered the remaining distance in 3 steps and put his head in her hand. Torres's face did something that it had probably not done in front of any professional at any facility in 4 months. She didn't cry exactly, but her face lost its architecture for a moment. The careful arrangement came down, and she let it stay down for a few seconds before she pulled it back up. Bravo leaned into her hand. Emily sat quietly in the chair and did not take notes and did not say anything and gave the moment its full space. When she came out, Cole was in the hallway, and he looked at her with the expression he'd been developing all morning, that particular mix of bafflement and respect that he hadn't quite organized into a coherent attitude yet. Torres, he said. She needs a medical reassessment on the arm, Emily said. I think there's more pain there than she's reporting, and someone needs to go through Bravo's vet records with her, together, so she can see his physical recovery. She's carrying guilt about the accident that's built on information she doesn't fully have. Cole wrote something down. And the dog. Bravo's fine. He's waiting for her to stop protecting him. She paused. They're both doing the same thing to each other. Cole looked at her for a second. You got that in... He glanced at his watch. 14 minutes, she said. I know. She was already moving toward room 2. Who's in the wheelchair? Staff Sergeant Devin Okafor, 29, Marine, lost partial use of his right leg in a blast injury 8 months ago. His dog, Kestrel, has been with him since before the injury. 2 failed placements, same as Atlas. One of the placement attempts ended when Kestrel bit a trainer. Emily stopped. Why? The trainer used a correction technique that Kestrel interpreted as a threat to Okafor. A pause. Yes, that's the current theory. It's not a theory, she said, and kept walking. Okafor was not going to warm up easily, and she knew it before she was through the door. He was sitting in the wheelchair beside the window, not toward the room, and the angle of his shoulders communicated that the window was not what he was looking at. He'd chosen the position because it put his back to the wall and gave him sight lines on both the door and the secondary entrance, which was the positioning of someone for whom situational awareness had become automatic and had not been turned off by the change in environment. Kestrel, the black and tan Malinois, was between Okafor and the door. The dog's eyes moved to Emily the moment she entered. She didn't look back directly. She crossed to the far side of the room, as far from Kestrel's established position as the space allowed, and sat on the floor. Okafor turned his head toward her. He didn't say anything. "I'm not here to run a session," Emily said. "To the floor, mostly. I've been down here this morning with the other 3 units. I'm just going to sit here for a minute." Okafor said, "On the floor." "Yeah." "You always do intakes on the floor?" "I don't do intakes," she said. "I'm a trauma nurse." A silence. Kestrel's eyes were still on her, that unblinking Malinois attention that felt like being measured. "Why's a trauma nurse on the 4th floor?" Okafor said. "Wrong door," Emily said. "It's been a morning." A pause. And then, unexpectedly, Okafor made a sound that was not quite a laugh, too short and too controlled for that, but belonged in the same category. "Wrong door," he repeated. "Yeah." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Still not comfortable. But the quality had changed. Kestrel sat down. It was the first time, based on what Cole had told her, that the dog had sat voluntarily in any intake room in 2 attempts at 2 facilities. Emily registered it in her peripheral vision and did not react to it, because reacting to it would have changed whatever had produced it. "The trainer who got bit," Emily said after a minute. She kept her voice conversational. No setup, no framing. Kestrel wasn't being aggressive. Okafor's body went still. "How do you know that?" "Because Kestrel's been watching me since I came in the room and I haven't done anything threatening, and he's sitting down now, so he knows threat from non-threat just fine." She paused. "The trainer did something that looked like an attack on you, and Kestrel responded to that." A long pause. "They wrote it up as a behavioral failure," Okafor said. His voice was flat. "In both placements. The dog is unpredictable. The dog is a safety liability." His jaw was tight. "They wanted to separate us." "I know." "He's not unpredictable." Something moved under the flat voice. Not quite anger, but the substrate of it. "He's doing exactly what he's trained to do. He's protecting." He stopped. "You," Emily said. Okafor looked at her. "You don't know anything about this dog." "No," she agreed. "But I've been in this wing for 3 hours, and I've watched 3 other dogs doing versions of the same thing. They're not broken. They're responding to real information about their handlers." She paused. "Kestrel knows you're in pain. He knows you're not moving the way you moved before. He knows the environment is full of people he doesn't have context for. And he's been making decisions about threat and safety with limited information in facilities that kept trying to separate him from the one reference point he has." Okafor was very still. "2 facilities wrote him up as a liability," Emily said. Nobody asked what he was responding to. The silence lasted long enough that she thought she might have pushed too far. Then Okafor said quietly, "He slept across my legs the first night I was home from the hospital. Wouldn't move. I kept waking up because of the weight, and every time I opened my eyes, he was just there, looking at me." A pause. "I didn't tell the intake people that. I didn't tell anybody that." "You can tell me," Emily said. Kestrel stood up, walked across the room, sat down next to Emily on the floor, approximately 8 inches from her left knee, and looked at Okafor. Okafor stared at his dog. "He hasn't done that with anyone," he said. "Not since Harmon." "He's telling you something," Emily said. "What?" "That he's okay," she said, "and you can be too." Something shifted in Okafor's face, the controlled surface cracking at one specific point, a fracture line that had probably been there for a while. He didn't speak. He extended his hand, palm down, and Kestrel turned and put his nose against it, and Okafor's hand closed around the dog's muzzle gently, the way hands close around something they've been afraid of losing. Emily stood up slowly. She moved toward the door without making it a departure, just a natural drift, giving the space over. In the hallway, Cole was waiting again. He had stopped looking baffled. He had moved into something more complicated, a kind of focused attention that reminded her of how he'd looked at the case files, except now the case file was her. "Okafor," he said. "He needs a pain management review," Emily said. "His leg. He's compensating more than the intake noted, and Kestrel's been responding to physical stress signals that the medical team may have minimized in the documentation. She started toward the medical bay. And the trainer who got bit at the second placement, I'd pull the incident report. I think the technique used was one Kestrel had specific conditioning against, and nobody flagged it. Cole fell into step beside her. How do you know about canine conditioning protocols? She didn't answer immediately. Emily. My grandfather, she said. He trained canine units, military and law enforcement. I grew up around working dogs. She paused. I'm not a specialist. I want to be clear about that. You have been clear about that, Cole said, several times. Because it's true. It's also increasingly technical for someone who keeps describing herself as just a trauma nurse. She stopped at the medical bay door. Through the small window, she could see the third handler, a young soldier, maybe 22, with the look of someone who had been awake for too long and was past the point where sleep would straightforwardly fix it. The golden Labrador was lying beside his cot, touching his handler's hanging hand with the top of its head. What's his name? Emily said. Corporal James Whitley. His dog is Pharaoh. What happened to them? Cole was quiet for a moment. Whitley was the last person with his previous handler before that handler was killed. He's carrying survivor's guilt. The psych team flagged it, but Whitley doesn't engage in talk therapy. 3 sessions, 3 shutdowns. He paused. Pharaoh was the previous handler's dog before the assignment was transferred. So Pharaoh is grieving too. They're both living in the same loss, Emily said. Yes. She looked through the window at Pharaoh's head resting against Whitley's hand. Give me a few minutes. Emily, Cole's voice stopped her. For what it's worth, what you've done this morning. I've been doing this for 37 years. He stopped, seemed to weigh something. I want to know how you're doing this. She looked at him. I'm listening, she said. That's all it is. It wasn't all it was. But it was the true part of it, and the rest wasn't something she was ready to put into words in a hospital hallway, with Cole looking at her like she was a file he hadn't finished reading. She went into the room. Whitley looked up when she came in, and his face did what 22-year-old faces do when they've run out of the energy required to perform anything. It just showed what was there, which was exhaustion and grief, and a specific kind of shame that was sitting on top of both like a lid. Pharaoh didn't move from his position beside the cot, but his eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully. Emily sat in the chair. She looked at Whitley and then at Pharaoh and then back at Whitley. You were with him, she said. No preamble. The handler before you. Whitley's face went rigid. How do you... It's in your chart. I'm not guessing, she paused. You don't have to talk about it. I don't, he said, flatly. Okay. A silence. Pharaoh's tail moved. Once, slow. He talked about Pharaoh all the time, Whitley said, and the words came out like he hadn't fully decided to say them. Constantly. What Pharaoh liked. What he didn't like. What he'd do when they got back. His hands were in his lap, both of them, pressed flat against his thighs. I thought it was annoying, at the time. Emily didn't fill the silence. And then Pharaoh was mine, and I didn't know any of it. What he liked. I had to start from scratch. The dog didn't know me, and I didn't know him, and he kept looking past me, at the door. Whitley's voice was steady, in the way that required constant maintenance. Like he was waiting. He was, Emily said. I know. A pause. I know. Pharaoh lifted his head off the cot edge and looked at Emily, then at Whitley, then back. He's not waiting anymore, Emily said. He's here with you. He shouldn't be, Whitley said. And there it was. The thing under everything, the sentence that had been organizing all the other sentences. He was supposed to stay with Marcus. That was the plan. That was the... He stopped. His jaw worked. I shouldn't have Pharaoh. Someone else should have him. Someone who... Who what? Emily said. Whitley didn't answer. Who didn't survive when Marcus didn't, she said, quietly. Not cruelly, Lee. That's what you mean. The silence was profound. Pharaoh stood up. The dog was large enough that standing changed the architecture of the room. He walked around the cot, stood directly in front of Whitley, and then, with the deliberateness of an animal making a specific choice, He put both his front paws on Whitley's knees and pushed his face against the young soldier's chest. Whitley's hands came up automatically, closed around the dog's sides. "He chose you," Emily said. "That's not an accident, and it's not a consolation prize. He's been with you for 2 months, and he's still here." She paused. "Let that mean something." Whitley's shoulders shook once, just once. Then he held still, both arms around the dog, face turned slightly away, doing the work of staying in one piece that young men in military wards do with a ferocity that is both admirable and exhausting to witness. Emily stood and moved back toward the door. She was in the hallway, leaning against the wall, when she became aware that the hallway had more people in it than it had had 20 minutes ago. Not just Cole and Kruger and the MPs. Several others had materialized, 2 more from the veterinary staff, a woman in hospital administration clothes, and one person she didn't recognize at all who was standing at the far end of the hall with a tablet and watching her with an expression that she couldn't fully read except that it was not casual. Cole came to stand beside her. 6 units, she said. All 6. In one morning. 7, Cole said. She looked at him. "Atlas," he said. "He counts." She let out a breath. The back of her neck hurt. She hadn't eaten since before her shift. Her 7th-floor patients were being covered by Pete, who would not say anything about it, but who was also covering his own full patient load, and she owed him something substantial. "I need to go back upstairs," she said. "I know." Cole paused. "I need to ask you something first." She waited. "The things you said to these handlers, about loss, about waiting." He chose his words carefully. That wasn't just technique. She looked at the far end of the hallway. The person with the tablet had moved slightly closer. "No," she said. "Someone who didn't come home," Cole said. "Careful, not pushing." She was quiet for a moment. "My brother," she said. 3 years ago." Cole nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. The people who immediately said sorry were usually the ones who wanted the information filed and the conversation moved past. Cole just nodded, and she understood that he was absorbing the information the way she'd absorbed information about the handlers this morning, adding it to a model, making the model more accurate. "That's why the dogs respond to you," he said. "They can read what you're carrying." "Maybe," she said. "It's not a maybe." She pushed off the wall. "I'll come back down before my shift ends and check on all 6. "Emily," Cole's voice stopped her again. It was a different tone this time. "Colonel Hartfield made some calls while you were in with Okafor. I don't know exactly what he said, but the person at the end of the hallway arrived about 10 minutes after those calls." She turned and looked at the far end of the corridor. The person with the tablet was watching her with the specific attention of someone who is evaluating rather than observing. "Who is that?" she said. Cole said, "Her name is Major Sandra Keel. She's from the Office of Military Canine Affairs. She oversees reintegration program assessments for the entire Eastern Command." Emily looked at Keel. Keel looked back at her. "Why is she here?" Emily said, though she already felt the shape of the answer. "Because Hartfield told someone at command that a trauma nurse on the 4th floor had done more in one morning than 6 weeks of specialist intervention." Cole paused. "And command, apparently, has a decision to make about this program." "What kind of decision?" Cole's voice was careful. "The kind where someone needs to assess whether the current approach is working." Emily looked at Keel. Keel had not moved, had not looked away, and was now writing something on her tablet with the deliberateness of someone making a notation that was going to matter later. "And if it's not working," Emily said, "what happens to the program?" Cole was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. "They shut it down," he said, "and the animals go to a federal assessment facility in Renner for final determination." Final determination. She knew what that meant, too. She looked back at Keel, who had finished writing and was now walking toward her with the even pace of someone who has made a decision about what happens next, and whose decision was not necessarily going to account for what Emily had seen this morning in 6 different rooms. And Emily felt something solidify in her chest that was not exactly anger and not exactly fear, but was made of both of them and something harder underneath. Keel stopped 4 feet away. She was 40, maybe 45, and she had the face of someone who had written a great many reports that had ended things. "Ms. Vasquez," she said, I'd like to speak with you about your involvement this morning. A pause, and the pause had an edge. And I'd like to understand exactly what authority you believe you've been operating under. Emily looked at Keel for exactly 2 seconds before she answered. I'm not operating under any authority, she said. I'm a trauma nurse who was asked by Dr. Cole and Colonel Hartfield to remain on the floor. If that's a problem, take it up with them. Keel's expression didn't change, which meant she'd been expecting pushback and had already decided it didn't matter. I've spoken with both of them. I'm speaking with you now. She glanced at the tablet. You had unsupervised contact with 6 military working dogs in active behavioral crisis. You conducted what appear to be informal psychiatric assessments of 6 military personnel without credentials, clearance, or protocol authorization. And based on what I've been told, you made medical determinations about at least 2 handlers without... I identified a handler with cardiopulmonary symptoms and requested a specialist consult, Emily said. That's within my nursing scope. And I didn't assess anyone psychiatrically. I talked to them. About their trauma. About their dogs. Keel's pen stopped moving on the tablet, just briefly. Ms. Vasquez, the cardiology consult on Petty Officer Salazar, Emily said. Has that come back yet? A pause. Keel looked at Cole. Cole said carefully, Results came in about 20 minutes ago. And? He glanced at Keel, then back to Emily. Premature ventricular contractions, consistent with sustained physical stress suppression over an extended period. Cardiology wants him for a monitored observation period and is recommending an echocardiogram. Emily turned back to Keel. She didn't say anything. She let the information sit in the air between them and do its own work. Keel's jaw moved slightly. That's a medical finding. It doesn't speak to the behavioral protocols. It speaks to why Ghost was doing what Ghost was doing, Emily said. The dog was responding to a real physical problem that 2 facilities missed because everyone was focused on the dog. The behavioral assessment process wasn't looking at the right thing, Emily said. None of it was. The dogs aren't the problem. They've been accurately reading their handlers the entire time. The problem is that the people assessing them kept treating the dogs as the primary variable. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, one of the dogs, she thought it was Kestrel, based on the pitch, made a low sound and went quiet again. Keel looked at her for a long moment. It was the look of someone conducting a rapid reassessment that they hadn't planned to need. You have a background in veterinary behavioral science? No. Canine training? No official training. Then explain to me, Keel said, and her voice had shifted. Still controlled, but the edge had changed quality, become something more like genuine inquiry beneath the professional surface. How a trauma nurse with no formal credentials in this area walked into 6 active behavioral cases in one morning and produced results that 2 specialized facilities could not produce in 8 weeks. Emily looked at her. Because I didn't walk in trying to fix the dogs, she said. I walked in looking at the people. Another silence. Longer this time. Cole made a small sound that mocked Emily. I need to observe you directly, she said. 1 session. I need to see what you're doing. There are no more sessions today, Emily said. These animals and their handlers have been through enough for one morning. Anything else today sets back what's already been gained. I'm not asking for... I know what you're asking for, Emily said. And I'm telling you that walking another evaluator into those rooms right now would be a mistake. Give them the afternoon. Come back tomorrow morning. Keel stared at her. The stare had layers. Professional affront. And something underneath it that was more complicated. The look of someone who was used to being the most informed person in any given conversation and was finding that position unexpectedly occupied. You're telling me, Keel said slowly, how to conduct my assessment. I'm telling you what these animals need, Emily said. What you do with that is your decision. The hallway held its collective breath. It was Hartfield who broke it. He'd appeared at the corridor junction, apparently having caught enough of the exchange to read the room. Major Keel. His voice was even, but had the undertone of a man who outranked her by enough to make subtlety optional. Walk with me. Keel held Emily's gaze for one more beat. Then she turned and walked toward Hartfield. Emily exhaled through her nose, quietly, so no one would hear it as a release of anything. Cole said, under his breath, "That was inadvisable." "Probably," she agreed. She has the authority to recommend program termination to Eastern Command. Today. Without additional review. I know. And you just told her she was wrong about her own assessment timeline. She was wrong about her assessment timeline, Emily said. Being right about it doesn't change that she was wrong. Cole looked at her with the expression he'd been developing all morning. That complicated mix that had started as bafflement and was working its way towards something she didn't have a clean word for. Go eat something, he said, and check your 7th floor patients. I'll call you if anything changes down here. She went. Pete was in the break room when she got back to 7, eating a sandwich with the economical focus of someone working through a limited window. He looked up when she came in. How bad? He said. Not bad? She sat down across from him. Complicated. Complicated how? She told him the condensed version. Pete listened the way he always listened, fully, without filling silences, with occasional small adjustments in his expression that communicated he was tracking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. This Major Keel, he said. She can actually shut it down? According to Cole. And if she does? Emily looked at the table. The animals go to a federal assessment facility. She paused. Final determination. Pete set down his sandwich. Okay, he said. So we're not letting that happen. She said. You've been down there all morning. Your patients are covered. You've got a full shift tomorrow. He paused. Yes. She looked at him. Pete was 46, had been a nurse for 22 years, had 3 kids and a commute he complained about in a way that meant he didn't actually mind it, and he was one of approximately 4 people at Maple Crest whose judgment Emily trusted without qualification. I don't know what I'm doing, she said. You've been doing it all morning, he said. That seems like the wrong time to stop. She ate a granola bar from her bag, which was not a meal but was something, and checked her patients. The post-surgical was stable, the 2 others were progressing as expected, the 4th had a question about her discharge instructions that took 12 minutes to work through properly, because the patient's daughter was on speakerphone and had questions of her own. By the time Emily had managed all of it, 2 hours had passed, and it was early afternoon. Her phone buzzed. Cole. Atlas is up. Walking the room. She stared at the message. Atlas, who had been flat on the floor, chin on paws, barely maintaining. Walking the room, she went back down to 4. The corridor was quieter than it had been that morning. The MPs were gone, the excess personnel had cleared out, and the space had settled into something closer to its ordinary operational state. Donna was still at the desk, which meant Donna's shift was long today, which happened sometimes and which Donna managed by becoming approximately 15% more formidable as the hours passed. She's in room 3, Donna said, without being asked, which meant Emily's destination had been obvious. Emily went to Atlas's room. He was standing near the window. Not the corner, not the center of the floor, but near the window, which was streaming afternoon light across the padded flooring. His head was up. His tail was doing something that wasn't quite a wag, more like a slow, uncertain movement, the physiological equivalent of a person who hasn't smiled in a long time, trying to remember how. Kruger was in the room, seated on the floor. She'd taken Emily's approach and applied it, which said something good about her ability to observe and adapt. She looked up when Emily entered. Her eyes were bright in a way that professional composure was working hard to contain. Emily sat down. Not near Atlas, across the room, same position as the morning. Atlas looked at her. The animal that had been a study in absence this morning was now present in a way that was almost startling. Not recovered. She was not going to call it recovered, because she had enough experience with grief, in humans and apparently in dogs, to know that morning's first movement was not the same as healing, but present, awake, oriented. He walked to her. Not fast, not with the energy of a dog who had been fixed. With the careful, deliberate pace of a dog who had decided, after a long internal debate, to take a step and see what happened. He stopped in front of her, looked at her with those eyes, the specific eyes of an animal who had seen a handler die and had kept showing up anyway. Emily put her hand out, palm up, not reaching toward him, just available. Atlas put his nose against her palm. The warmth of it was specific and real, and Emily had to do her own version of Pete's controlled composure to stay where she was. She sat with him for 30 minutes. When she finally stood, Kruger stood too, and they walked out together, and neither of them said anything in the hallway because there wasn't anything to say that the room hadn't already said better. Cole was at the nurse's station, and Keel was with him. Emily had not expected Keel to be back so soon. She'd said tomorrow morning, and she'd meant it, and the fact that Keel was standing at the nurse's station at 2:15 in the afternoon meant that the conversation with Hartfield had not gone the direction Emily had been hoping. Keel looked at Emily when she came around the corner, and her expression had changed since the hallway confrontation. Not softer, exactly, but the aggressive edge had been replaced by something more difficult to read. Major Keel wanted to review the morning's case notes, Cole said. His voice was neutral. I've been walking her through them. The cardiology report on Salazar, Keel said, and the updates on Webb and Torres and Okafor. She paused. These are significant shifts. Yes, Emily said. I've been in this field for 12 years, Keel said. I've conducted assessments of over 40 reintegration programs. I've never seen 6 units show measurable progress in a single session. Emily waited. I've also never seen a civilian nursing staff member conducting de facto behavioral interventions on military K-9 units without any formal framework. Keel held up a hand before Emily could speak. I'm not saying what you did was wrong. I'm saying I don't know what to do with it from an administrative standpoint. Then don't do anything with it administratively, Emily said. Document the outcomes and leave the method alone. I can't do that. If this program moves forward, Emily said. Keel met her eyes. The program has been under review for 8 weeks. The outcomes before today did not support continuation. I was sent here to make a determination. She paused. Today's outcomes are different, but I need to understand what produced them before I can recommend anything to command. Why? Emily said. Keel blinked. Because, why do you need to understand the mechanism before you can accept the outcome? The outcomes are documented. The animals are measurably improved. The handlers are measurably improved. Emily kept her voice level. Is the program objective to produce outcomes, or to produce outcomes through approved mechanisms? The silence was sharp enough to cut on. Cole, to his credit, said nothing. He had the expression of a man watching something he'd known was going to happen and was now watching happen. Keel took a slow breath. You're not wrong, she said. It sounded like it cost her something. You're also not making my job easier. I'm not trying to make your job easier, Emily said. I'm trying to make sure those 6 rooms down that hall don't get classified as failed cases. Another silence. Keel looked at her tablet, then at the case notes Cole had spread across the desk, then at Emily. Tomorrow, Keel said. I'll be here at 0800. I want to observe at least 2 sessions. I won't intervene. I won't direct. I observe. She paused. Can you agree to that? Yes, Emily said. And I'll need your personnel file. Emily said, why? Because if I'm recommending continuation of this program based in part on your involvement, I need to know who you are. The professional armor was back, but different. Less offensive, more structural. That's not optional. Emily held her gaze. Fine. Keel nodded once, picked up her tablet, and walked down the hall. She paused at Atlas's room window, looked in for a moment, and then kept walking. Cole waited until the corridor door had closed behind her. Then he said, personnel file. I know, Emily said. There's nothing in your personnel file that explains this morning. I know, she said again. He looked at her steadily. Is there anything I should know before she pulls it? A pause. Emily looked at the desk, at the case notes spread across it, at the 6 names written in Cole's precise handwriting in the margins. My grandfather's name was Donald Vasquez, she said. He retired as a master sergeant from the Army in 1987. After that, he spent 22 years as a K-9 trainer for the Dunbar Falls Police Department and the County Sheriff's Office. He trained working dogs for search and rescue, narcotics detection, and handler protection. She paused. He also ran an informal program for retired military K-9s through our property in Elton County for the last 12 years of his life. I grew up on that property. Cole was very still. I've been around working dogs since I was 4 years old, she said. I watched my grandfather rehab animals that every official channel had written off, not with techniques, with time and presence. And she stopped, started again. He used to say that a dog in crisis was never the problem. The dog was always the most honest thing in the room. The problem was everything around it. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Cole said. He died when I was 26, she said. 6 months before my brother deployed. A pause. I didn't go into veterinary work because I couldn't, after both of them. I needed to work with people. I needed to do something where I was fixing something that could be measured. Vitals, labs, post-surgical recovery. She looked up. I've been a trauma nurse for 7 years and I'm good at it. That part's not complicated. And the part that brought you to 4 this morning? Wrong door, she said. But she said it differently than she had with Okafor, and Cole heard the difference. Wrong door, he said. Not mocking, just acknowledging the particular truth that some wrong doors were more significant than others. She went home at 7 p.m. after a full shift on 7, which meant she'd been at Maple Crest for over 12 hours, and she ate leftover rice standing over her kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment she didn't have the energy for. She slept for 6 hours, which was less than she'd wanted, and was back at Maple Crest by 6:45 a.m. She checked her 7th-floor patients first, which was discipline. She was not going to become someone who neglected her actual assignment for the floor that had become interesting. 2 of her patients were doing well. One had developed a low-grade fever overnight that needed attention, and she spent the first 40 minutes of her shift managing that and making sure the handoff notes from the night shift were complete and accurate. At 7:50, she went down to 4. Keel was already there. She was standing at the nurse's station with Cole, and she had a different tablet this time, larger, official-looking. And there was a man with her that Emily hadn't seen before. 45 in civilian clothes with the posture of someone who was not a civilian, holding a folder that was thick enough to have weight. Cole saw Emily and said, "Good morning," with a particular precision that communicated more than the words. "Good morning," Emily said. She looked at the man with the folder. He looked back at her without introducing himself. "This is Dr. Paul Renner," Keel said. "He's the senior behavioral consultant for the Office of Military K-9 Affairs. He flew in this morning from the Eastern Command Office in Cartwell." Emily looked at Renner. He was studying her the way she'd been looked at a lot in the past 24 hours, evaluatively, with a thoroughness that felt like being read rather than seen. He had the kind of face that defaulted to skepticism, not out of hostility, but out of professional habit, the face of someone who had spent a long time being the expert in the room. "Dr. Cole briefed me on yesterday's sessions," Renner said. His voice was even. "I've reviewed the case notes," he paused. "I reviewed your personnel file as well." "There's not much in it," Emily said. "No," he agreed. "There isn't." He opened the folder. She expected to see her file. Instead, she saw something else. A series of printed photographs, black and white, the particular grain of older photo printing. "Your grandfather's program in Elton County," he said. "We had a file on it. Informal rehabilitation program for retired military K-9s, operating without federal oversight, over a period of approximately 14 years. Emily looked at the photographs. She recognized the property, the long fence line, the wide run, the low-roofed outbuilding where her grandfather kept the transition kennels. She recognized one of the dogs, a Belgian Malinois named Sergeant, who had come to them from a Fort Delray decommission in 2003 and had lived on the property for 6 years. "You had a file on my grandfather's program," she said. "It came up in an audit of informal K-9 programs 7 years ago," Renner said. "The program was noted as, and I'm reading directly here, operating outside certified frameworks but producing outcomes inconsistent with available resources and methodology." He looked up. "The audit recommended no action because the program was self-funded, caused no harm, and the outcomes spoke for themselves." A pause. "The audit also noted that the program's primary working assistant, age approximately 20 to 26 over the course of the program's operation, demonstrated an unusual understanding of handler-animal relationship dynamics." Emily was very still. "That was you, Renner said. "He was my grandfather," she said. "I helped him. For 14 years. On and off, I had school, and then my nursing program." Renner closed the folder. He looked at her for a long moment. "The audit flagged your grandfather's methods as non-standard. I describe what you did yesterday in this wing as non-standard." He paused. "Is it possible that non-standard is what's required here?" Before she could answer, the door at the end of the corridor opened. Webb was there. Sergeant Marcus Webb, in the hallway, upright, out of his room, which was, according to the schedule Cole had mentioned, not supposed to happen until an accompanied walk later in the week. He was in civilian clothes, not a hospital gown, and he had Ranger on a lead, and Ranger was walking beside him with the loose, purposeful gait of a dog doing what he was built to do. The entire nurses' station went still. Webb walked up the corridor. His shoulders were not squared. They had the slight inward set of someone who was managing pain, physical or otherwise. But he was walking. He stopped when he reached Emily. "I wanted to show you," he said. He was not performing it. His voice was flat in the way of someone who did not have a lot of words available, but wanted the ones he did have to land clearly. "He slept on the floor next to my bed last night. Both of us slept." He looked at Ranger, then back at her. "Both of us." Emily looked at the dog. Ranger was looking at her with that amber, measuring gaze, and his tail moved twice. "That's good, Marcus," she said. "Simple, direct. That's really good." Webb nodded once, turned, and walked back down the corridor. Ranger matched his pace exactly, that slight adjustment to the handler's rhythm that working dogs carry in their muscle memory. Renner was watching the corridor. 11 days, Cole said quietly. He's been in this ward for 11 days and has not left his room voluntarily. Renner said nothing. He was looking at the space where Webb and Ranger had been. Keel had her tablet out and was writing something, but her movements had slowed, which meant whatever she was writing was not the note she'd come in planning to write. "I'd like to observe the session with Atlas," Renner said, "and with Torres." He paused. "And I'd like to do that now, if possible, before I say anything else." Emily took them to Atlas's room first. The dog was in the same position as when she'd left the previous evening, near the window, standing, awake. He turned his head when she came through the door, and the movement was so different from the inert flatness of the day before that Renner made a sound that was below the threshold of a word, but was clearly involuntary. She did not perform anything. She sat down in her usual position, and Atlas walked to her at his pace, and she extended her palm, and he put his nose against it, and she sat with him while the room did what rooms do when people stop trying to fill them. Renner and Keel were outside the window. She was aware of them as a background fact the way she was aware of the ventilation system, present, not relevant to what was happening in front of her. After 20 minutes, she stood, and Renner was at the window with the expression of a man whose working model had just been revised in real time. Torres's session was next. Torres was better than the day before, but not dramatically, not transformed, but measurably less armored. She let Bravo onto the cot beside her, which was not a protocol-sanctioned behavior and which Emily did not comment on. They talked about the vehicle accident, a little, in the careful and non-linear way that real conversations about hard things happen, circling, doubling back, landing on a detail, and sitting there for a while before moving. Emily asked her about Bravo before the injury, what he was like. Torres talked about it, and her voice changed when she did, became less managed, more like a person and less like a file. When Emily came out, Keel was standing at the corridor window with her arms crossed and the expression of someone conducting a reassessment they hadn't planned to need. Renner said, "She's not running a protocol." "No," Cole said. "She's not using any recognizable behavioral framework." "No." "And it's working." Cole paused before he said it. "Yes." Renner looked at Emily. He had the folder under his arm, and he opened it again, not to the photographs this time, but to something at the back, a document she couldn't fully see. "I want to ask you something directly," he said, "and I want a direct answer." "Okay," she said. "What you did yesterday, what you're doing now." He paused. "Is this something you can teach?" The hallway went very quiet. Emily thought about her grandfather, about the years on the Elton County property, about the afternoons spent watching him sit in a field with a dog that didn't trust anything and wait, simply wait, until the dog decided to move. She thought about the particular knowledge that lived in her hands and her voice, and her ability to stay in a room without filling it. Knowledge that had never been in a classroom, had never been written down, had passed from one person to another the way real knowledge often passes, through proximity and repetition and paying attention. "I don't know," she said. "Honestly, I've never tried." Renner nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected and maybe the one he'd been hoping for. He looked at Keel. Something passed between them. The conversation of two people who had been working together long enough to have shorthand. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Not dramatically. the face of someone trained to keep their reactions internal. But the change was there, around the eyes and the jaw. The specific tightening that Emily had seen 100 times in the trauma bay when information arrived that was worse than the expected information. He stepped away to take the call. Keel watched him, her arms uncrossed. She looked at Cole, then at Emily. Renner came back. He put the phone in his pocket with the deliberate care of someone controlling their movement because their movement wanted to be less controlled. "There's been an incident," he said. "Harmon Base. 40 minutes ago." Keel went still. "What kind of incident?" "A handler in the active K9 unit, Staff Sergeant Dario Mercer. He was scheduled for a transfer to this facility next week. His K9, Vega, a 3-year-old shepherd, has been in behavioral hold at the base since last month." Renner's voice was even, each word deliberate. "Mercer attempted to access Vega's kennel at 0620 without authorization. The base handlers tried to intervene. The situation escalated." "Is Mercer injured?" Cole said. "He's contained," Renner said, which was not the same as answering the question. "The concern is Vega. The dog is in acute distress. Base veterinary staff is on site, but they're—" He stopped. "They're not managing it." The hallway was completely silent. Renner looked at Emily. And the look was not the evaluative look of a man assessing a file. It was the look of a man who had run through his available options and arrived at the end of the list. "Harmon Base is 32 miles from here," he said. "If we leave now, we can be there in 40 minutes. He paused. "I'm asking you to come." Emily looked at him. She looked at Cole, who was watching her with an expression that was not pressure and not permission, but something in between. The expression of someone who understood what was being asked and what it would cost and was not going to make the decision for her. She looked at the corridor. 6 rooms, 6 handlers, 6 animals who had started somewhere different than where they were this morning, and who would need to continue, and who she had told herself she would check on, and who now had to be left in the hands of a team that had not been able to reach them for 6 weeks, because 32 miles away, a man and his dog were in a situation that was being described in the careful, controlled language that military personnel use when the honest language would be too loud for a hallway. "Let me call Pete," she said. She called Pete. He picked up on the second ring and she said 6 words and he said 2 back. "I've got it," and hung up. She turned to Renner. "Let's go." They were in the vehicle, Renner driving, Keel in the passenger seat with her phone to her ear, Emily in the back with the folder that Renner had left on the seat. When Emily opened the folder to the back document she hadn't been able to read in the hallway, it was a behavioral assessment form. Harmon Base, dated 3 weeks prior. At the top, Mercer, Dario A, SSG, and below that, Vega, K9 Unit 7 Alpha. She read through the assessment. The language was clinical and the conclusions were careful, and they added up to something that sat in her chest like a weight. Because between the clinical language and the careful conclusions was a story she recognized, a handler who was deteriorating and a dog who was escalating, and a system that was tracking both of those things separately and not seeing them as the same event. At the bottom of the page, a notation that had been added by hand, different ink, recent. Handler removed from kennel access 11 days ago per base command. Dog has not eaten in 7 days. 7 days. She looked out the window at the interstate moving past at 70 miles an hour and thought about Atlas, who had lifted his head. About Pharaoh, who had pressed himself against Whitley. About all the dogs who had been assessed as behavioral failures while they were, in fact, the most accurate readers in the room. She thought about what 7 days without eating meant for a working dog's body. She thought about what it meant for a dog who was not broken, who was grieving, who was waiting. "What's Mercer's status?" she said. Specifically. Renner glanced in the mirror. Psychiatric hold. He forced his way past 2 handlers to get to Vega's kennel at 0620. He was restrained. He's physically unharmed. And before the kennel incident, what was he before? A pause. Progressive withdrawal over the past month, stopped attending group sessions. His handler supervisor flagged a change in his baseline 3 weeks ago. And they removed his access to Vega. Standard protocol when a handler is in psychological assessment, to prevent exactly what happened, Emily said, which happened anyway. Keel turned in her seat to look at Emily. Her phone was down. "You're saying the protocol caused the incident?" I'm saying the protocol didn't account for what happens to the dog when you remove the handler, Emily said, or what happens to the handler when you remove the dog. She looked at the assessment form. They're not two separate cases. They never were. Keel turned back to the front. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Renner, "She's right." Renner said nothing. His hands were steady on the wheel. He was driving at 82 miles an hour on an interstate that had a 75 limit, which was the amount of urgency he was allowing himself to express. They took the Harmon base exit at 9:47 a.m. The gate personnel were expecting them. Keel's phone call had done its work, and they were waved through to the K9 facility at the east end of the base, a low building surrounded by chain-link runs. There were 4 vehicles in the lot that hadn't been there for a regular morning. 2 base security, 1 veterinary unit, and 1 that Emily didn't recognize. The sound reached her before she was fully out of the car. Not barking. That sustained guttural sound that had no clean category, that she had heard through a stairwell door that felt like a week ago, and which was louder here, and which had an edge to it that the sounds at Maple Crest hadn't had. She walked toward the building. A base handler intercepted them at the door. Young, 20s, trying to look like he had the situation contained and not succeeding. "The dog is in kennel 6. Our vet tech is at the door, but she can't get in. Vega's been, since we tried to do the morning welfare check, he's been—" "Where's Mercer?" Emily said. "Medical wing. Is he sedated?" A pause. "No, No." Emily turned to Renner. "I need Mercer here. He's in psychiatric hold. I know. I need him here anyway." She looked at the handler. "What's between the kennel building and the medical wing?" "About 200 meters. There's a service road." "Get a vehicle." She looked at Renner. "I'm going to the kennel. You get Mercer here. Don't sedate him. Don't restrain him more than you have to. Get him to the kennel building in the next 10 minutes. "Emily," Renner said, "Vega is in acute crisis." The base vet assessed him as, "I know what the assessment says," she said. 7 days without eating, escalating distress. Attempted self-injury during morning check 2 days ago. She had read the whole form. "He's not dangerous. He's desperate. There's a difference." She paused. "Get Mercer." She went into the kennel building without waiting for the answer. The smell was different from Maple Crest. More animal, less antiseptic. The smell of working dogs and outdoor runs, and the specific atmosphere of a facility that existed for function rather than rehabilitation. The hallway was narrow, concrete block, kennels on both sides behind heavy-gauge doors with small mesh windows. The sound was coming from the 6th kennel, and even in the narrow corridor it was substantial. The vet tech at the door was a woman in her 30s, crouching, speaking through the mesh in a low voice. She stood when Emily came up. "He won't settle," the tech said. "We can't get the door open without—" "It's okay. Step back, please." Emily crouched in front of the mesh window. Vega was a German shepherd, 3 years old, large, black and tan, and he was moving in a tight circle near the back of the kennel with his body low and his movements disconnected from the pattern of a dog pacing. This was something different, something that lived below pacing, the movement of an animal in a state that was beyond anxiety and approaching something more fundamental. There was a water bowl overturned in the corner. The food from the morning check was untouched. He looked at the mesh window. His eyes found Emily. The circling slowed. 1 rotation, half a rotation. Then he stopped. She did not speak. She crouched at the mesh and looked at the floor just inside the kennel door. The same principle. Not direct eye contact, not pressure, just presence. She could hear the vet tech breathing behind her. She could hear, somewhere outside the building, the sound of a vehicle. 10 minutes, she had said. Vega took 1 step toward the door. Stopped. She stayed. He took 2 more steps, and he was close enough to the door now that she could see the condition of his coat. Dull. The specific dullness of an animal who has not been eating, who has been spending energy on distress for an extended period. His ribs were more prominent than they should have been on a 3-year-old working dog in active service. She heard the building door open behind her. Vega's head lifted. His body went rigid. And then she heard the sound she had not expected. Not a bark, not the guttural distress call. A sound that was almost a whine, high and brief and completely unlike anything she'd heard from him in the past 10 minutes. A recognition sound. The specific frequency of a dog hearing something it had been waiting 7 days to hear. She turned. Mercer was in the doorway. He was in the clothes they'd put him in for the psychiatric hold, not uniform, and he had not been restrained, which meant Renner had followed her instruction, which meant Renner had made a decision about trust in the past 10 minutes. He looked like a man who had been awake for days and had been through something in the last 2 hours that had taken more out of him than he had left to give. He looked past Emily, at the kennel door, at the mesh window where Vega was pressed against the inside of the door, with every piece of his body oriented toward the hallway. "Hey, buddy," Mercer said. His voice broke on the second word. Vega made a sound that Emily was going to hear for a long time. It was not a bark, and it was not a whine, and it had no clean name in any language she knew, and it communicated, with a clarity that required no interpretation, that this dog had been waiting for exactly this voice for exactly 7 days and had not stopped believing it would come. Emily stood up. She looked at Renner, who was behind Mercer, and who had the expression of a man who had stopped conducting an assessment because the thing he was looking at had moved past the category of assessment. She looked at the kennel door. And then the veterinary tech's radio crackled, and the voice on it said 3 words that changed the geometry of everything that was about to happen. Base command, lockdown. The word lockdown had a physical quality in a confined space. Emily felt it in the air before she fully processed it. A shift in pressure, the way everyone in the narrow corridor simultaneously recalibrated their relationship to where they were standing. The vet tech's radio crackled again. All non-essential personnel to designated holding areas. This is not a drill. The tech looked at Emily, then at Renner, then at the kennel door where Vega was pressed against the mesh with his whole body oriented toward Mercer, making that sound that had no clean name. Renner's phone was already out. He stepped back toward the building entrance, speaking low. Keel was on her own phone. The base handler who had met them in the parking lot had moved to the corridor junction and was talking into his radio with the focused, rapid delivery of someone getting information faster than he could fully absorb it. Emily did not move from the kennel door. "What's the lockdown for?" she said to the vet tech, keeping her voice level. "They don't always say on the first call," the tech said. "Could be a security perimeter issue, could be—" She stopped, listening to something on her radio. Her face changed. "It's the psychiatric wing," she said. Emily turned. "What about the psychiatric wing?" The tech hesitated. She looked at Mercer, who was still in the doorway, still looking at the kennel, his whole body oriented toward his dog with the same unthinking gravity that Vega was directing back at him. The radio said something else, and the tech took a step back and lowered her voice. "A patient forced egress from the holding area about 15 minutes ago. They've contained the situation, but they're doing a full building sweep." "A patient," Emily said. "Which patient?" The tech looked at her radio, then at Mercer. Emily understood before the tech said it. "He was the only one in psych hold this morning," she said. "Technically there were 3, the tech said, but the other 2 were medically sedated, and the one who forced egress was trying to get here," Emily said. She looked at Mercer. He had heard enough of it to understand what was being said. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were still on Vega, and his hands, hanging at his sides, had closed into fists that were not about aggression. They were the fists of a man who has run out of other options and has chosen the one that was available. "You left the psych wing," Emily said. Mercer said, "I had to get to him." "I know." She paused. "What did you do to get out?" He was quiet. Mercer. "I told the duty nurse I was having a cardiac event," he said. It came out flat. "When she came close enough, I moved around her. I didn't touch her. I didn't hurt anyone." Emily absorbed that. "You scared someone." "Yeah." His jaw worked. "I know." From behind him, Renner came back into the corridor. He had the look of someone who had been on a call that was not about this building, not about this kennel, and had returned to find that the situation had acquired new dimensions while he was occupied. "The lockdown is administrative," Renner said. "Not a threat situation. They'll lift it in approximately 20 minutes. He looked at Mercer. "You need to go back to the medical wing." Mercer looked at the kennel door. Vega was still pressed against the mesh, still making that sound. "I'm not going back there," Mercer said. "Not without seeing him." "Staff Sergeant, he hasn't eaten in 7 days. Mercer's voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. "You understand what that means for a dog his size? 7 days. Because you put me in a hold and told him I wasn't coming back. You—" He stopped. His voice had started to move and he brought it back. "He doesn't understand holds. He doesn't understand protocol. He understands that I stopped coming. Renner said, I understand that. The protocol was, I don't want to hear about the protocol, Mercer said. It came out quiet. Not loud, not aggressive, just very final. The corridor was silent except for Vega. Emily looked at Renner. He was running the calculus she could see him running. Institutional against individual. The protocol that had produced this outcome against the outcome it was looking at right now. She had watched enough people run that calculus to know it could go either direction. Open the kennel, she said. Renner looked at her. Not all the way. Enough for Mercer to get a hand through. The dog hasn't eaten in 7 days. He's physically weakened. He's not going to be aggressive toward his handler. She paused. But if we stand here for 20 minutes while the lockdown clears and then send Mercer back without letting him reach Vega, we will not get another opportunity like this one. The vet tech looked at Renner, waiting. Renner was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, half the door. You stay at the entrance. The vet tech unlatched the kennel door and pulled it open 8 inches. Vega came through the gap like water. Not explosive, not aggressive, just immediate and inevitable. His whole body finding Mercer with the precision of something that had been oriented toward this exact point for 7 days. He pressed himself against Mercer's legs, and the sound he'd been making finally stopped, and the silence where it had been was almost louder. Mercer's hand went into the dog's fur. He said nothing. He bent slightly, not crouching, just a fold at the waist, and his hand moved across the back of Vega's neck, and the dog's tail moved for the first time since Emily had entered the building. She looked at the food bowl on the floor of the kennel, untouched. Get him something to eat, she said to the tech. Not the standard ration. Start small. His digestive system has been in stress. Small amounts. The tech nodded and moved. Emily turned to Renner. He needs to stay with the dog through the lockdown. And when the lockdown lifts, I need a conversation with whoever made the decision to remove his kennel access. Renner said, That was a base command call, above my authority to... Then get me to the authority that made it, Emily said, because what you're looking at right now is the outcome of that decision, and it needs to be part of the conversation about what happens next. Renner looked at Mercer and Vega. He looked for a while. Then he took out his phone again. The lockdown lifted at 10:23. The building personnel slowly returned to normal operations around the kennel corridor, giving the space at Mercer's end of the hallway a wide berth. Some out of protocol, some out of the specific human impulse to leave alone a thing that looked like it needed to be left alone. Vega ate a small amount of food from the tech's hand, then from Mercer's, then from a bowl placed directly in front of him. Not much, but something. By 11:15, they were in a conference room in the base administrative building, and the room had more people in it than Emily had anticipated. Renner had made his calls, and those calls had generated countercalls, and the result was a table with 7 people around it. Renner and Keel on one side, a base colonel named Whitmore, and a major named Feist on the other, a base JAG officer at the far end who had arrived without explanation and hadn't offered one, and 2 people Emily didn't recognize who had the bearing of senior staff and the silence of people waiting to see which direction a thing was going to fall before they committed to a position. Emily was at the table because Renner had said, "Join us," in the corridor with a tone that was not a request, and because she had decided at some point in the kennel building that this was the room she needed to be in, regardless of whether she'd been invited to it. Nobody had introduced her. Nobody had asked her to leave. Colonel Whitmore ran the meeting. He was 60, career military, with the face of a man who had made a great many decisions under pressure and considered his record on those decisions to be acceptable. He had a file in front of him and he opened it without preamble. The Mercer situation, he said. I want to understand what happened this morning and what the current status is. Renner walked through it. He was precise and complete, and he did not editorialize, which Emily noted as the behavior of someone who had made a choice about what the facts were going to be allowed to say for themselves. Whitmore listened. When Renner finished, Whitmore looked at the file. The kennel access removal was standard protocol for personnel in psychiatric assessment. My authorization. Yes, sir, Renner said. And the outcome was an egress incident from the medical wing, a lockdown, and a K9 who hadn't eaten for 7 days. That's correct. Whitmore looked at his file. His face did not show regret exactly, but it showed the recalibration of a man who had based a decision on a model and was now seeing the model's error in a form that was difficult to dismiss. The protocol exists because handlers in psychological crisis present a potential threat vector in K9 facilities. Respectfully, Colonel, Renner said, the protocol was designed for a different profile of handler-animal relationship than what we're seeing in the reintegration cases. The bond in these pairings is the removal of handler access doesn't reduce the animal's distress in crisis cases. It compounds it. That's not in the existing literature, Whitmore said. It will be, Renner said, after this morning. Whitmore looked at Renner, then at Keel, then, for the first time, directly at Emily. Who are you? He said. Not rudely, just the same direct military query she'd been fielding for 2 days. Emily Vasquez, trauma nurse, Maple Crest Veterans Medical Center. What's your role in this? I was at the Maple Crest K9 wing yesterday. Dr. Renner brought me to Harmon this morning for the Vega situation. Whitmore looked at Renner. A trauma nurse. She's the reason Vega is eating, Renner said, and the reason Mercer didn't have a full crisis in the kennel corridor. The colonel held Renner's gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Emily. Walk me through what you did. She did. Briefly, without framing it as anything other than what it was. She described the kennel approach, the decision to bring Mercer from the medical wing, the reasoning about handler-animal separation, and the specific physiology of a dog who has stopped eating under relational stress. She used the correct terminology where she had it, and plain language where she didn't. When she finished, the JAG officer at the end of the table, who had not spoken, wrote something down. The two silent senior staff were no longer silent in their body language. They had both shifted toward the table. Whitmore said, "And your assessment of the current protocol?" "The protocol is treating the handler and the dog as separate cases," Emily said. "In standard clinical context, that makes sense. In a bonded K9 reintegration context, they're one case. Separating them to manage one doesn't manage the other. It creates a second emergency." Whitmore was quiet. He looked at Major Feist, who was beside him. Feist had been looking at his own file and had the expression of someone who had known something was off about the protocol for a while and had not known how to name it. "Major Feist," Whitmore said, "your assessment." Feist looked up. He was in his 40s, careful, with the manner of someone who chose words based on what they were going to have to stand behind later. "The protocol was implemented 18 months ago after an incident at a different facility," he said. "The incident involved a handler in acute psychological break who caused injury to a canine trainer during an unsupervised kennel visit." He paused. "The response was to restrict handler access during psych assessment. The intention was sound." "The intention," Emily said, "didn't account for the dogs." Feist looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had been about to say that and had just had it taken from him in a form that was more direct than he'd intended to use. "No," he said, "it didn't." There was a silence at the table that was doing work, the kind of silence in which a decision is forming before anyone has said it out loud. Then Keel spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "I want to be direct about what I observed this morning and yesterday." She put her tablet on the table. "I came to Maple Crest with authorization to recommend program termination. The outcomes I've observed in the past 24 hours do not support termination. They support a fundamental revision of the assessment and treatment protocol across all 3 facilities currently running reintegration programs." She paused. "The current approach has a structural error. We have been treating behavioral crisis in canines as a veterinary problem. It is not. It is a relational problem, and the person who identified that error most clearly is not in this file system anywhere." She looked at Emily. The table looked at Emily. She did not perform anything under the weight of it. She looked back steadily, in the way she looked at patients who were working up to something difficult, giving them the space to get to it without filling it for them. "I'd like to understand what's in your background that we're not seeing in a personnel file," Whitmore said. She told him. The Elton County property. Her grandfather. 14 years of informal canine work alongside a master sergeant who had never bothered to file it as anything official because he hadn't seen any reason why a thing that worked needed paperwork explaining why it worked. She told it the same way she'd told Cole, without ornamentation, without making it bigger than it was. When she finished, the JAG officer at the end of the table looked up from his notepad for the first time. "Your grandfather's program, the county audit 7 years ago." "Yes," she said. "I pulled that audit this morning," he said. His voice was dry and precise. "After Dr. Renner made his calls. He looked at a page in his folder. The audit flagged the program. The recommendation was no action. There was a note at the bottom. He looked up. The note recommended that the county consider whether any of the informal training could be documented and incorporated into certified frameworks. He paused. It was not acted on. Nobody told my grandfather that, Emily said. No, it was a note in a closed audit file. He tapped his pen against the paper. Until this morning. Emily looked at him. She was starting to understand that this room had more history in it than she'd walked in with, and that some of that history had been moving toward this table before she'd ever set foot in the kennel building. What's happening here? She said. Not aggressively, just directly. Renner said, There's a policy review underway, the reintegration program. It's been in process for the past 4 months, independent of my assessment visit to Maple Crest. The question on the table has been whether to continue the program, restructure it, or recommend termination and transfer to federal handling. And the review was leaning toward termination, Keel said, before this week. And now, Emily said. Whitmore said, now we have 2 days of outcome data that doesn't fit the existing model. He closed his file. We also have a protocol that produced a 7-day starvation situation in a 3-year-old working dog, a handler egress incident, and a base lockdown. His voice was even. I was not performing contrition. He was not that kind of man, but he was stating facts with the precision of someone who understands that accountability does not require theater. The protocol was mine. The outcomes were mine. That requires addressing. This was the part Emily had not expected. Not because she hadn't believed Whitmore was capable of it, but because in her experience, the people who made protocols rarely named their ownership of the outcomes those protocols produced with such flatness. Sergeant Mercer's status, she said. He'll be transferred to Maple Crest next week as originally scheduled, Whitmore said. Vega goes with him. The access restriction is lifted effective today. He looked at Feist. I want the protocol reviewed by end of week. I want a memo that addresses the handler animal unit as a single treatment case, not 2 separate tracks. Feist wrote it down. Yes, sir. And I want the Maple Crest program status updated. He looked at Keel. Pending your formal recommendation. Keel said, I'll submit a recommendation for continuation with expanded scope. The framework needs to account for what I've observed. That'll require documentation. She looked at Emily when she said it. The look said, and you're going to be part of that documentation, which is going to require a conversation we haven't had yet. Emily looked back. She understood. The meeting ended at 12:40. They walked out through the administrative building and back toward the parking area, and the base had returned to its ordinary operations. The lockdown's residue was only visible in the extra traffic near the medical wing and the slightly elevated communication frequency on the radios of the handlers they passed. Renner walked beside Emily. I was quiet for half the length of the building, which was his version of processing out loud. Whitmore will follow through, he said finally. He's not a man who says things he doesn't intend. I know, Emily said. That's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? She looked at the kennel building across the lot. Through its small windows, the row of runs was visible, and in the 6th one, Mercer was sitting on the floor with Vega beside him. She could see them from 50 meters. She couldn't see Mercer's face from this distance, but she could see the way his hand was moving along the dog's side, slow, rhythmic, the touch of someone who is doing the thing they've been prevented from doing and is now doing it with the specific quality of attention that comes from knowing what it costs not to. The other programs, she said, the ones not in this facility, not at Maple Crest. Renner was quiet for a moment. There are 6 active reintegration programs under Eastern Command, 3 under Western. Same protocols. The same protocols are mandated across all of them, yes. So the same outcomes, she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. She looked at the kennel building. How many animals? Currently active cases across all programs. He paused. Approximately 43 canines in behavioral assessment, roughly 60 handlers in parallel treatment. He paused again. Plus the animals in federal holding awaiting final determination who were transferred out of the active programs. How many in federal holding? Renner's voice was careful. 11. Emily stopped walking. Renner took 2 more steps and stopped beside her. 11 animals who were transferred out because the protocol failed them, she said. The protocol determined they weren't responding. The protocol was looking at the wrong thing, she said. You know that now. Yes, he said. I know that now. So what happens to the 11? He was quiet for a longer beat. Final determination at a federal facility means, I know what it means, she said. What I'm asking is whether there's a review process, whether yesterday and today change anything for them. Renner looked at the kennel building. He looked at it for a while. That's not a decision I can make on a parking lot, he said. It requires a formal review petition, authorization from the program office, a reassessment protocol, all of which requires someone to initiate it, Emily said. Yes. Are you going to initiate it? He turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man who had come to Maple Crest with a specific task and was standing in a parking lot with the task having become something larger than the category he'd put it in. Yes, he said. It was the same 2 syllables Pete had said on the phone that morning, and they landed with the same weight. Not a grand commitment, not a performance of resolve, just a simple factual statement about what was going to happen next. Thank you, Emily said. They drove back to Maple Crest. Keel sat in the front passenger seat and worked on her tablet, and Emily sat in the back, and nobody talked much. At one point, Keel turned halfway in her seat and said, "The documentation I mentioned, for the formal recommendation, I'll need a statement from you about your methodology." "I don't have a methodology," Emily said. "I have an approach." "Then a statement about your approach." Keel turned back to the front. "And your background, the Elton County program, your grandfather's work, the specifics." She paused. "In writing, official." "Okay," Emily said. "It won't be optional," Keel said. "I want to be clear about that. If I'm recommending program continuation and expansion based in part on what I've observed, your role in the outcomes needs to be formally documented." "I understand." "Your hospital will need to be informed of your involvement. It's possible your department head will have—" "I'll handle my department head," Emily said. Keel went back to her tablet. They got back to Maple Crest at 2:20 in the afternoon. Emily went directly to the 7th floor, checked her patients, apologized to Pete in the concise, genuine way that Pete preferred over the extended version, and spent an hour being a trauma nurse on a trauma floor because that was what she was, and the grounding it provided was not nothing. At 3:45, she went back down to 4. The afternoon had changed the wing. Not dramatically. This was not a movie where everything was obviously different, but there was a quality to the air in the corridor that was different from the pressurized weight of the morning before. Cole was at the nurse's station reviewing case notes. Donna was at her desk. Kruger was coming out of Atlas's room with the careful energy of someone who has been part of something and is still processing it. "Atlas ate dinner," Kruger said when she saw Emily. "She said it the way you say something that matters to you when you're trying not to make it obvious how much it matters to you. A full portion." He pushed the bowl with his nose when it was empty. Emily nodded. "Good." "Torres asked if she could see the other handlers tomorrow," Kruger said. "Webb and Okafor. She said she wanted to meet the people whose dogs she'd heard through the walls." Emily looked at Cole. He was watching her with the expression that had been developing since the previous morning, and it had settled into something she could finally name. Not admiration, not professional assessment, but the specific look of someone who has revised a working model and is still adjusting to the new dimensions. "Keel filed her preliminary recommendation," he said, "about an hour ago." "Already?" "She's not someone who waits when she's decided something." He paused. "The recommendation is continuation with expanded scope." She cited yesterday's and today's outcomes specifically. He looked at the case notes in front of him. She also cited the protocol error at Harmon. She included a recommendation for protocol review across all Eastern Command programs. "And the 11 animals in federal holding?" Cole was quiet. "She noted that in the recommendation, a reassessment petition." He paused. "It's not guaranteed. The federal facility has its own authorization chain, but the petition is in." Emily sat down in the chair at the nurse's station. She was tired in a way that had moved past the body and into something more foundational, not depleted exactly, but running close enough to the edge of her reserves that she was aware of the edge. "How's Salazar?" she said. "The echocardiogram confirmed the PVCs. They're starting him on a medication protocol. The cardiologist thinks the suppression of physical symptoms over an extended period allowed a manageable arrhythmia to become more established than it should have been." Cole paused. "Ghost hasn't left his side." The medical team has stopped trying to move him. Emily looked down the corridor. Through the window of room 2, she could see the edge of the Malinois's dark form beside the cot. Constant, patient, accurate. "There's something I need to tell you," Cole said. His voice had changed tone slightly. Not serious in the way of bad news, but careful in the way of something he'd been deciding whether to say. She looked at him. "I called a colleague this morning," he said. "Dr. Alicia Navarro. She runs the Canine Behavioral Program at Western Command Veterinary Center. I've known her for 20 years. He paused. "I told her about yesterday. About you." "Why?" Emily said. "Because Navarro's been trying to solve the same structural problem Keel is now writing memos about. And she's been trying to solve it through conventional channels for 3 years, and she's been blocked at every turn." He looked at the case notes. "She's presenting at the National Military Working Dog Medicine Symposium in 6 weeks, Fort Aldane. She called me back an hour ago." Emily said, "Cole." "She wants you on the panel," he said. "Not as a speaker, as a case presenter. Your observations, your approach, the outcomes from yesterday and today." Emily looked at him. "I'm a trauma nurse. I'm not a panel presenter at a military medicine symposium." "I know," Cole said. "Navarro doesn't care. The people in that room will care." "Some of them," he said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "Some of them won't." She looked at the corridor again. The 6 rooms. The 6 dogs. The people she'd sat with on floors and at bedsides and at the mesh of a kennel door, all of them carrying something that the systems around them hadn't known how to read. "Let me think about it," she said. Cole nodded. He turned back to his case notes. She was almost at the elevator when Donna said, without looking up from her desk, "The thing you said in the room with Atlas, the first morning." Emily stopped. "He promised to take you home," Donna said. She was looking at her screen. "You said that. To the dog." A pause. "My son served 2 deployments. He came back, so I'm not in the same place as some of these handlers." She paused again, longer. "But that thing you said, where does that come from?" Emily stood at the end of the corridor for a moment. "My brother," she said. "He didn't come back from his." Donna looked up from her screen. She had the face of a woman who had understood more about this situation than she'd been letting on and had been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge it. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. Clean and direct, the way genuine sympathy sounds when it's not trying to perform itself. "Thank you," Emily said. She took the elevator up to 7. She finished her shift. She drove home. She was in her apartment at 8:30 p.m., sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold while she'd been looking out the window at the street, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She picked up. "Miss Vasquez." The voice was male, mid-range, carefully neutral in the way of someone who was choosing neutrality as a tool. "My name is Captain Leland Marsh. I'm calling from the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. We've been informed of your involvement in the Maple Crest Canine program and the Harmon Base incident today." She set down the cold tea. "Okay. I need to ask you a few questions about your activities over the past 48 hours, Marsh said. "Specifically, the nature of your access to military personnel and canine assets, and the authorization under which that access was granted." The room was very quiet. Emily looked at her kitchen window. Outside, the street was ordinary. A car passed. A dog walker. The everyday texture of a city that had no idea what had happened 32 miles away in a concrete kennel corridor. "I'm happy to answer your questions," she said, "but I'd like to know who requested this inquiry first." A pause on the line. The careful pause of someone who had not expected the question. "That's not standard procedure." "I'm sure it isn't," she said. "I'd still like to know." Another pause. Longer. "The inquiry was initiated by a complaint filed this morning with the base command at Harmon, alleging unauthorized access to restricted military assets and conduct outside the scope of a civilian medical employee's authority." Emily said, "Who filed the complaint?" The pause this time was different. Not the pause of someone choosing a response, but the pause of someone who had arrived at the edge of what they'd been authorized to say and was deciding whether to step over it. "Major Dennis Feist," Marsh said. "He filed it at 1300 hours, approximately 20 minutes after the conference room meeting concluded." Emily sat very still. "Feist," The man who had written the protocol. The man who had sat at the table and said, "The protocol didn't account for the dogs." In the measured, careful tone of someone who was in the process of deciding whose side of a falling structure he was going to be standing on. The man who had taken notes when Whitmore gave him the directive to review the protocol by end of week. 20 minutes after the meeting, he had filed a complaint. "Captain Marsh," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Did you read the outcome reports from Maple Crest before you called me?" A pause. "I have the summary from Major Keel's preliminary recommendation." "Yes." "And the Harmon incident report?" "Yes." "Then you have the context for my involvement," she said. "I was present at Maple Crest with the authorization of Dr. Warren Cole and Colonel James Hartfield. I was brought to Harmon with the authorization of Dr. Paul Renner. Every contact I had with military personnel and animals was made with the knowledge and in the presence of authorized military officers." She paused. "Major Feist was present for some of it, including the kennel corridor." Another pause, longer than the others. "I see." "I'm available to speak with your office formally," she said. "I'd recommend you pull the full documentation from Dr. Renner and Colonel Hartfield before that conversation. I think it'll save us both time." "Yes," Marsh said. A different quality to his voice now. Not less professional, but recalibrated. "I think that's the appropriate next step." "Good night, Captain," she said. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, looking at her phone. Feist had been in that room. He had watched Whitmore take ownership of a protocol error. He had written down the directive to review it, and then he had walked out and filed a complaint against the person who had made the error visible, which was not the act of a man who had genuinely said what Emily had thought he'd said at that table. She thought about the phrase, "The protocol didn't account for the dogs." She thought about the careful, measured way he'd said it. She thought about the fact that the complaint had been filed 20 minutes after the meeting ended, which meant it had been composed during the meeting, which meant the thing he'd said at the table had not been a genuine reckoning. It had been positioning. She called Renner. He picked up on the third ring. "I know," he said, before she could speak. "You know. Hartfield called me 40 minutes ago." Feist copied base command on the complaint. "Hartfield was not pleased." A pause. "He's pulling the complaint. Can he do that?" "He's a colonel, and it was filed through his base command chain, so yes." Renner's voice had something in it that was not quite satisfaction, more like the specific fatigue of someone who has spent a long career watching exactly this kind of thing happen. Feist wrote the protocol. The protocol produced the Harmon incident. Whitmore gave him a direct order in that room, and he walked out and filed a complaint rather than execute it. That's a different category of problem. "What happens to him?" Emily said. "That's above my authority," Renner said. "But Hartfield is not a man who tolerates it when people try to cover their errors by going after someone else." He paused. Feist made a miscalculation. He assumed the complaint would create enough administrative interference to slow the protocol review. He didn't account for the fact that Hartfield was already looking at the same evidence we all were. Emily looked at her kitchen window. "He filed it 20 minutes after the meeting." "I know," Renner said. "He was writing it while Whitmore was talking. He said the right things in that room." "Yes," Renner said. "He did." A pause. "Some people do that, say the right things, and then go do the other thing when nobody's watching." I underestimated how many people were watching. She absorbed that. Outside, another car passed. The ordinary street. "The 11 animals," she said. "Still moving forward," he said. "The petition was submitted before Feist filed the complaint, so it's in a separate track. It's not affected." He paused. "Emily, go to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be—" "I know what tomorrow is going to be," she said. She ended the call. She rinsed her cold teacup. She went to bed. She was asleep when her phone lit up with a message from an unknown institutional email address. The subject line reading "Formal Inquiry Withdrawal," and below that 3 paragraphs of administrative language that amounted to Feist's complaint being nullified at 21:47, less than 9 hours after it had been filed. She didn't see the message until morning, but what she also didn't see, because it had been sent 12 minutes after Feist's complaint was withdrawn from an email address that was not institutional, was a second message. No subject line. 3 sentences. "The symposium panel has a slot, 6 weeks. Navarro wants an answer by Friday. Also, there are 43 animals currently in the active programs. Not just the 11 in federal holding. 43. They all need what you did yesterday. She read both messages at 6:12 a.m., standing in her kitchen in yesterday's socks, waiting for the coffee maker to finish. The withdrawal notice she read twice. The second message she read 3 times, and then she put her phone face down on the counter and stood there looking at the coffee maker until it beeped. 43 animals. Not 11. Not the 6 at Maple Crest or the 1 at Harmon. 43. Currently inside active programs. Currently being assessed through a protocol that had been looking at the wrong variable since the day it was written. 43 dogs in various stages of what Atlas had been, present in body, absent in every way that mattered, while the people around them filed paperwork about behavioral failure and treatment resistance. She picked up her phone. She typed one word to Renner's number, Friday. Then she poured her coffee and went to get ready for work. The drive to Maple Crest took 22 minutes. She used 18 of them thinking and 4 of them listening to the radio without hearing it. By the time she pulled into the staff lot, she had the shape of something in her mind that wasn't a plan yet. Plans required specificity she didn't have, but was the architecture that a plan would eventually fill. Pete was in the break room when she got to 7. He was on his second cup, reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who had been following a story and was waiting for the next installment. "How bad?" he said. Their shorthand again. "Not bad," she said. "Big." She told him about the complaint, about Feist, about the withdrawal, about the message from Renner and the 43. Pete listened in his complete way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The symposium," he said. "Fort Aldane. 6 weeks. You gonna do it?" She got a mug from the cabinet. "I said Friday. That's not an answer." "I know," she said. "It's what I have right now." Pete looked at his coffee. "You know what your problem is?" "I have several." "You keep describing yourself as just a trauma nurse," he said. "Like that's an apology for something." He set his cup down. "You've been a trauma nurse for 7 years. You've handled codes, multi-trauma, post-surgical crisis, family notifications in the middle of the night. You've done all of that while carrying something that most people would have sat down under." He paused. "The 4th floor didn't happen despite all of that. It happened because of it." She looked at him. "Do the symposium," he said. He picked up his cup and walked out of the break room. "Also, your first patient is asking about her discharge timeline again, and her daughter is already on speakerphone." She went to work. The morning on 7 was full in the way trauma mornings are full. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the relentless density of people who needed things, and the work of providing those things with accuracy and consistency, and enough humanity that the people didn't feel like a checklist. She liked that density. She had always liked it. It was the thing that had drawn her to trauma work in the first place. The way it required your complete attention, the way it left no room for the mind to wander into its own darker corridors. At 11:30, she went down to 4. The corridor was different again. 2 days had produced a texture that 5 weeks before had not existed. A quality of settled activity that was not the loaded stillness of crisis, but something that had more room in it. Donna was at the desk. Kruger was at the far end of the hall with a clipboard. Cole was coming out of Torres's room with his case notes held loosely at his side rather than gripped, which was a physical tell she had learned to read. "Torres wants to start handler group sessions," he said when he saw her. "She brought it up herself this morning." "That's good," Emily said. "It's remarkable," he said. 2 days ago, she wouldn't say her dog's name in a session. She walked the corridor. She checked in on all 6 rooms, not with the urgency of the first morning, but with the steady attentiveness of someone monitoring progress that was real and fragile and needed to be treated as both. Webb and Ranger were doing a supervised walk in the facility courtyard. Through the window, she could see them moving at a slow pace along the paved path, Ranger's shoulder at Webb's knee. Both of them quiet in the particular quiet of 2 beings who have re-established a language between them. Salazar was sitting up in his cot reading, which was the most ordinary thing she'd seen in that room, and Ghost was lying along the wall with his eyes half closed, present but not vigilant. Okafor had gotten out of the wheelchair and was standing at his window, Kestrel beside him, both of them looking out at the courtyard where Webb and Ranger were walking, and Okafor's hand was resting on the back of the dog's neck with the ease of something that no longer needed to be thought about. Atlas was at the window again, standing. tail doing that slow, uncertain movement that was working its way towards something more confident by degrees. Whitley was on the floor with Pharaoh, not doing anything in particular, just sitting there together, Pharaoh's head in Whitley's lap, both of them in the specific suspension of two beings who have decided that for right now, this is enough. She stood in the hallway for a moment after completing the circuit, and she let herself feel the weight of what had happened in these 6 rooms over 48 hours. Not triumphantly, not sentimentally, but with the honest acknowledgement that something real had occurred here, something that mattered in a way that was not going to shrink back to its previous size. Her phone buzzed. Renner. She picked up. Feist, he said. What about him? Hartfield convened a review board this morning. The complaint Feist filed is part of it, but it opened into a broader review of decisions he made regarding the protocol implementation and the Harmon Kennel access restriction. A pause. It appears that when the protocol was implemented 18 months ago, there was an internal memo from the base veterinary staff at Harmon flagging the handler separation provision as potentially counterproductive in bonded canine pairs. The memo went to Feist's office. It was not forwarded. Emily was quiet. He received a specific documented caution about the provision that produced the Vega situation, Renner said, and he didn't act on it and didn't share it. Because it would have undermined his protocol, Emily said. That appears to be the case. Renner's voice was even. The review board is not something I'm part of. Hartfield runs it, but the outcome is likely to be significant. How significant? That's Hartfield's determination. A pause. Emily, I want to be clear about something. The complaint Feist filed against you. It was an attempt to create enough administrative noise to prevent the protocol review from moving forward. He saw the direction the meeting was going, and he made a calculation. Another pause. The calculation failed. And the reason it failed is that the evidence of what you did over the past 2 days is documented in 7 different case files, 3 military officer accounts, Keel's preliminary recommendation, and the outcome reports from this morning. There is no version of an administrative inquiry into your conduct that survives contact with that documentation. I know, she said. I want to make sure you know, he said, because people file those complaints betting that the target will be too tired to fight it, or too uncertain of their standing. She looked down the corridor, at Webb and Ranger through the courtyard window, at Atlas at his window. I wasn't going to fight it, she said. I was going to answer their questions honestly and let the documentation do what documentation does. A beat of silence. Then Renner said, Yes, that's actually more effective. I know, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. Friday, he said. For Navarro. I'll tell her. Tell her I'll send her a written summary of the approach before the panel, Emily said. She should know what she's getting. She knows what she's getting, Renner said. That's why she's asking. She ended the call and stood for another moment in the corridor. Cole came to stand beside her. He'd been nearby enough to hear the shape of the conversation without hearing the content, and he looked at her with his settled, recalibrated expression. Feist, she said. I heard, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Hartfield called me directly, courtesy call. He paused. Hartfield is the kind of person who believes in keeping people informed when they were part of a situation he had to correct. He's going to be significant, Emily said. The outcome of the board. Yes, Cole said. He is. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has watched protocols hurt people before and is experiencing, for the first time in a while, the institutional machinery moving in a direction that corrects rather than compounds. She went back upstairs. She finished her shift. She stayed 20 minutes past the end of it to complete a handoff note thoroughly because the night shift nurse was new to her patient's specific case, and Emily had learned over 7 years that a sloppy handoff was a gift that kept giving in exactly the wrong ways. Then she drove home and she sent Navarro a 3-page summary of the approach she'd been using for 2 days. Not framed as methodology, not dressed in clinical language, just written plainly and honestly in the same voice she used when she talked to handlers in rooms, because that was the only voice she actually had, and it had worked so far. Navarro responded at 11:52 p.m. 2 sentences. This is exactly what I needed. See you in 6 weeks. The 6 weeks were not a movie montage. They were 6 weeks of work, full shifts on 7, daily check-ins on 4, the ongoing documentation that Keel's formal recommendation required, and the preparation for Fort Aldane that Emily approached with the same discipline she'd applied to her nursing boards, which meant she was thorough about it and not comfortable about it and did it anyway. FICE Review Board concluded in the third week. The outcome was public within the program, not released to the broader medical community, but circulated to all base commands and program administrators under Eastern Command. I was removed from his role as protocol administrator and reassigned to a non-oversight position at a facility in another state, effective immediately. The memo from the Harmon veterinary staff, the one he'd received and not forwarded, was entered into the formal record of the program review as evidence of a decision that had caused direct harm to a military working dog and his handler. Vega's 7-day starvation and Mercer's egress incident were cited specifically. The review board's finding was not discharged or dismissed. It was permanent. The protocol revision that Whitmore had directed was completed in the same third week. The handler separation provision was removed. In its place, a supervised joint assessment process, treating the bonded pair as a single clinical unit. The revision was implemented at Harmon immediately and submitted for adoption across all Eastern Command programs. It was not perfect. Emily knew it wasn't perfect because Cole showed her the draft, and she found 3 places where the language was going to create ambiguity in practice. And she wrote her concerns in a memo that Renner passed to the revision committee, and they incorporated 2 of the 3 changes and explained why the third would require a second revision cycle. She disagreed with that decision, mildly, and wrote it down, and moved on, because that was how institutional change actually worked. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the incremental and imperfect accumulation of corrections made by people who were willing to name what was wrong and stay in the room. The petition for reassessment of the 11 animals in federal holding was approved in the 4th week. Emily was not part of the reassessment team because she was a trauma nurse at Maple Crest and not a federal program officer, but Renner sent her the initial outcomes as they came in, one by one, over the following 10 days. 8 of the 11 showed measurable response within the first 48 hours of handler reunification assessment. 3 required longer timelines. All 11 were transferred out of federal holding to active rehabilitation programs. She did not let herself count this as a victory in any clean sense, because 3 of the 11 had been in federal holding long enough that the reassessment was going to be a long and uncertain road, and she was honest enough with herself to hold the uncertainty alongside the progress rather than choosing only one. Mercer and Vega arrived at Maple Crest in the 4th week, transferred as scheduled. Vega had gained back 3/4 of the weight he'd lost. He moved differently than he had in the Harmon Kennel building. Not like a dog who had been fixed, but like a dog who had been given back the thing that had been taken from him and was relearning how to carry it. He and Mercer had a room at the end of the K9 wing, and on the 2nd day Mercer knocked on the door of Webb's room, and Webb opened it, and the 2 of them stood in the doorway for a moment, handlers and dogs, strangers who weren't quite strangers. And then Webb moved back from the doorway in the universal gesture of making space. Torres started the handler group sessions in the 5th week. She ran them herself, with Cole observing and Kruger handling the animals, and she was not polished about it. She went off script and said things that were too personal and had to pull herself back twice. But she was real about it in a way that made the imperfection irrelevant. Okafor was the hardest room to crack. He came to the first session, didn't speak, came to the second, said 4 words, and by the third was the one asking the questions that nobody else was asking but everyone was sitting with. Whitley still didn't talk much. But Pharaoh had stopped sleeping apart from him, had stopped the hypervigilant positioning at the door, had started doing the things that young working dogs do when they are no longer managing a crisis. Playing, briefly, with a rope toy that Kruger left in the room. Eating with appetite, responding to commands with the quick, clean attention of an animal whose nervous system has been given permission to do its job without carrying the extra weight of someone else's grief. Emily watched all of it from the margins, the way she'd watched everything on the 4th floor from the first morning, attentively, without filling the space, giving the progress room to be what it was rather than what she needed it to be. The night before Fort Aldane, she didn't sleep well, not because she was afraid of the panel, exactly, but because she was honest enough to know that what she was about to walk into was a room full of people whose entire professional identity was built on the framework she was implicitly critiquing, and that some of them were going to have the same response Keel had initially had, which was professional affront dressed up as skepticism. and that she would need to hold her ground without being defensive and present her case without performing certainty she didn't have. She drove to Fort Aldane in the morning. The symposium was in the main conference facility, a large building that smelled like every large conference facility. Industrial carpet, recycled air, the particular ambient noise of 100 professional conversations happening simultaneously. She found Navarro at the registration table, a compact woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and the steady, unimpressed eyes of someone who had been in too many rooms with too many people who didn't know what they were talking about to be easily rattled by anything. "Vasquez," Navarro said. She shook Emily's hand with a grip that communicated directness rather than warmth. "Your summary was good. Don't soften it when you're in the room." "I wasn't planning to," Emily said. "People always plan not to," Navarro said. "Then they get in the room, and the faces make them hedge." She picked up her own badge from the table. "Don't hedge. The faces don't know what you know." Emily put on her badge. Emily Vasquez, Maple Crest Veterans Medical Center. No credential after her name, just the institution, which was the accurate representation of what she was, and she had not asked them to change it. The panel was in the afternoon. 3 presenters before her, all of them with extensive credentials and polished delivery and findings that were genuinely valuable. She was not dismissive of any of it, because the work was real and the knowledge was real, and the fact that it hadn't been sufficient didn't make it worthless. When she stood at the front of the room, she looked at approximately 200 people: military veterinarians, behavioral scientists, program administrators, people who had dedicated careers to the problem she'd walked into sideways through a wrong door 6 weeks ago. She did not start with her credentials, because she didn't have the kind that opened this kind of room. She started with Atlas. She described him the way she'd seen him, flat on the floor, chin on paws, eyes half open and pointed at nothing. She described what the room had looked like, what the experts in it had tried, what the 6 weeks of specialist intervention had produced. She described sitting down on the floor and saying 10 words to a dog who wasn't ready to hear commands. She did not describe it as a breakthrough. She described it as a beginning, because that was what it was, and the distinction mattered. She talked for 38 minutes. She showed Cole's case documentation on the screen behind her, the measurable outcomes, the timelines, the physiological data from Salazar's cardiology workup, the weight recovery trajectory for Vega. She talked about her grandfather's program in Elton County and the audit that had sat in a file for 7 years. She talked about the protocol error at Harmon and what it had cost a 3-year-old working dog and his handler. She did not soften it. The first question from the floor was skeptical in the specific way of a person who has a framework they've invested in and is looking for the flaw in the thing that challenges it. She answered it directly, without defensiveness, and then she said, "The outcomes are documented. I'm not asking you to accept my methodology. I'm asking you to look at what the outcomes are pointing toward and ask whether the current approach is producing the same results." The second question was from a woman in military uniform who asked about scalability. How do you train people to do what she'd described doing if the thing she'd described doing was as much about personal experience as professional knowledge? Emily said, "I don't know yet, honestly. But I know the first step is stopping the approach that's treating these animals as the primary variable when they're actually the most accurate diagnostic tool in the room." The third question was not a question. It was a statement from a man near the back of the room, senior, based on the insignia she could see from the front, who said that what she'd described was anecdotal and that anecdote was not a basis for protocol revision. She looked at him. 7 case files from Maple Crest documented outcomes across a 48-hour period following 6 weeks of specialist intervention that produced no movement. 1 case file from Harmon Base including physiological data on a K9 who had not eaten for 7 days and resumed eating within 2 hours of handler reunification. A protocol revision currently being implemented across Eastern Command following a formal review board finding. She paused. If that's anecdote, it's anecdote with a body of evidence attached to it. I'd invite you to read it before characterizing it. The room was quiet in a specific way. The quiet of people recalibrating. Navarro, from the side of the room, did not smile, but something around her eyes did. The panel ended. People came to talk to her afterward, some skeptical, some curious, some with the specific quality of attention of people who recognized something they'd been circling around without landing on. She talked to all of them. She did not perform certainty she didn't have, and she did not minimize what she'd observed, and she did not let anyone put it in a box that was too small for it. A program administrator from the Western Command stopped her as the room was clearing. She was 50-something, with the face of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had arrived at the point where she measured things by their honesty rather than their credentials. "The Western Command programs," the administrator said. "I have 12 active cases that fit the profile you described." "I know," Emily said. Renner mentioned the Western Command numbers. "I'd like to consult, formally." She paused. "I know you're a trauma nurse. I don't care. I've been a program administrator for 16 years, and I have 12 animals that aren't responding to anything I have available, and you just described what's wrong with what I have available in 38 minutes. Emily looked at her. She thought about Navarro's words that morning. "Don't hedge. Hedge. Send me the case files," Emily said. "I'll review them." She paused. "I'll want to consult with Dr. Cole on the K9 side. He's 37 years in military K9 medicine." "Fine," the administrator said. She handed Emily her card. "I'll send them by Friday." Emily took the card. She looked at it for a moment. The institutional seal, the title, the formal weight of it. And then she put it in her pocket and walked out of the conference room into the wide corridor of Fort Aldane, where the afternoon light was coming through the high windows, and the symposium was breaking up into smaller conversations that were going to continue in offices and over phones and in program rooms for months, which was how change actually moved. She drove back to Dunbar Falls. She was on the highway when the thought arrived, not dramatically, not with any particular emotional weight, just as a fact that had been forming and was now complete. She was not going to stop being a trauma nurse. She was not going to give up the 7th floor, or Pete, or the 2 a.m., codes, or the density and the clarity of work that could be measured in vitals and labs and recovery arcs. That was not negotiable. That was not what this was. But she was also not going to pretend that the 4th floor was a detour. It was not a detour. It was where she'd walked through a wrong door and found something that had been there since she was 4 years old on a property in Elton County, watching her grandfather sit in a field with an animal that had stopped trusting anything, giving it nothing but time and presence and the particular quality of attention that says, "I am not here to fix you. I am here because you matter." She got back to Maple Crest at 6:30. She had not planned to stop in, but she was in the building, and the elevator was there. She went to 4. The corridor was evening quiet. One nurse at the station. Donna had gone home. The lights were dimmed to the softer evening setting that the K9 wing used to ease the overnight transitions. She walked to Atlas's room. I was lying near the window, not flat in the way of the first morning, lying on his side, relaxed, with his legs loose and his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of a dog who has decided that the room he is in is safe. His eyes opened when she came in. He looked at her. She sat down on the floor. Old position, natural as anything. Atlas got up. He crossed the room slowly, with the dignified deliberateness of an older dog who has learned not to spend energy unnecessarily, and he lay down beside her. Not in her lap. Just beside her, close enough that his warmth was present along her left side. She put her hand on his back. He exhaled. She thought about her grandfather, who had never put his name on anything and had never needed to, who had understood that the work was the work and the work was enough. She thought about her brother, Marcus, who had come home in a box 3 years ago and whose absence had carved out a space in her that she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to carry rather than fill. She thought about the 11 animals who had been given back to something, about the 43 who were still mid-process, about the 12 in Western Command that she now had case files coming for. She was not going to save all of them. She was honest enough to know that. Some of them were too far into whatever Atlas had been in on the first morning, and even presence and patience had limits when a body had been running on grief for too long. Some of the institutional processes were going to move too slowly. Some of the protocol revisions were going to be half measures, but some of them she could reach. And some of the people she'd trained or consulted with or put in the room with the right information could reach others. And the 12 in Western Command would be a different conversation in 6 months than they were today. And the symposium room had held 200 people who were going to go back to their programs and look at their cases differently, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only way any of this had ever worked. Not the dramatic turnaround, not the single moment of reversal, but the accumulation of small, accurate things done by people who were willing to stay in the room. Atlas shifted slightly beside her. His tail moved once. He put his chin on her knee. She looked at him, at the gray around his muzzle, at the eyes that had been pointed at a corner 3 weeks ago and were now looking at her with the specific quality of an animal who has decided that someone is worth trusting. He had not forgotten Gunnery Sergeant Dwight Pruitt. She was not naive enough to think that was how it worked, that grief resolved cleanly into forward motion, that the space a lost person occupied simply filled in with someone new. Pruitt had promised to take him home. That promise lived in this dog's body the way certain things live in bodies, not as information but as something more fundamental. What had changed was not the grief. What had changed was that Atlas had found a place to put it down for a while. That was enough. That was, in fact, the whole of it. Not fixed, not cured, not moved past. Just given a place to rest. She sat with him until the evening nurse did her rounds. She scratched behind his ear when she stood up, which was not something she'd done before. The formal care she'd maintained with all of them had not included that. And Atlas leaned into it slightly, which was an answer. She drove home. The apartment was quiet. She made soupy, real soup, not something out of a can, because she'd been eating badly for 6 weeks and her body had begun to lodge specific complaints about it. She ate at the table instead of standing over the counter. She opened her laptop and started the initial framework for the Western Command consultation, which was going to take significant time and which she was not going to rush, and she worked on it for an hour until the thinking felt productive rather than obligatory. Then she closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of her apartment on a Wednesday night in an ordinary city in a country full of ordinary people, most of whom had no idea that there were animals in rehabilitation wings and kennel buildings and federal holding facilities who were carrying grief in their bodies with a fidelity that would shame most humans for its consistency. Who had never been broken, not one of them. Who had simply been accurate about pain, accurate about loss, accurate about the specific weight of waiting for someone who was not going to come. The systems around them had called that brokenness, had filed it as behavioral failure and treatment resistance and safety liability and last option in red at the bottom of a transfer form. And what it had actually been, every time, in every room, was the most honest thing in the building. She thought about what her grandfather used to say, that a dog in crisis was never the problem, that the dog was always the most honest thing in the room. He had said it to her the way people say things to children they're teaching, plainly and without drama, expecting the knowledge to live quietly until it was needed. It had lived quietly for 27 years. And then she had walked through a wrong door at 6:45 in the morning with a file folder she hadn't been paying attention to, and it had become the most useful thing she owned. She did not think of herself as exceptional. She thought of herself as someone who had been given a particular kind of knowledge and had spent a long time not knowing what it was for, and who now knew. That was not a transformation. That was not a dramatic reinvention. It was just clarity. The kind that comes not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of everything that preceded the moment, arriving finally at a place where it could be used. She was a trauma nurse. She was Donald Vasquez's granddaughter. She was Marcus Vasquez's sister. She was the person who sat on floors in hospital rooms and talked about grief with people who needed someone to sit on the floor with them. And she was not going to stop being any of those things, and none of those things were going to stop being useful. She went to bed. In the morning, she went back to work. She checked her patients. She managed a post-surgical complication with Pete and a consult with the night shift team and a family meeting that required 45 minutes of careful, truthful conversation about a prognosis that was not what the family had been hoping for. She did all of it with the same attention she always brought, the same steadiness, the same commitment to accuracy over comfort when accuracy was what people needed. And at noon, she went down to 4. All 6 dogs looked at her when she came through the corridor. Not in unison, not a movie moment. They were in their separate rooms, separated by walls and closed doors. But each of them, as she passed each window, turned their head toward her in that specific way that animals turn toward something they recognize. Ranger, Ghost, Atlas, Bravo, Kestrel, Sparrow, and at the end of the hall, through the newest room's window, Vega. 7 dogs, 7 different wounds, 7 different versions of the same essential truth, that they had never been broken, that they had been carrying something real, that they had been waiting for someone to look at them clearly instead of at the thing they appeared to be. She pushed open the first door. She sat down on the floor. She stayed. That was all. That was the whole of it. That was, in the end, the only thing that had ever mattered. The willingness to enter a room where someone is struggling and not immediately try to fix them. To sit with what is real. To give it the respect of your full attention and the dignity of your honest presence, without making them feel like a problem to be solved. Some people spend their entire lives learning that. Some never do. Emily Vasquez had learned it at age 4 from a man who trained dogs in a field in Elton County, and she had spent 27 years carrying it without knowing its full weight, and now she knew, and she was not going to put it down. The dog in front of her put his head in her lap. She put her hand on his back. Outside the window, the afternoon light moved across the floor.